燃え上がれガンダム。Hello and welcome to Weekly Suit Gundam, the special bonus podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I'm Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here to once again dive into the wacky and wonderful world of Mobile Suit Gundam and diving into, Jonathan, the 21st century. A bold new era with Mobile Suit Gundam SEED.
Indeed. I think maybe our most requested episode of the last year or so. In the early days, we had a lot of like, when are you getting to Zeta, Double Zeta, Char's counterattack? But we moved through those pretty quick, and I think after that, it has been a pretty consistent drumbeat of when are you getting to Gundam SEED? And we're going chronologically, so hopefully people figured that out. But we are now getting to Mobile Suit Gundam SEED, which I hear is a popular show, Sean.
Oh, yes, it's a very, very popular show. If you go to the 40th anniversary poll they did for Gundam, it's, I think, the number one ranked show was the original Mobile Suit Gundam. The number two ranked show was Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam, and then the number third ranked show was Mobile Suit Gundam SEED. So it was incredibly popular when it came out. Its popularity maintains, particularly the Japanese fan base, although it does have a pretty strong fan base over here as well. Because it is the defining Gundam show of the 21st century. Like, it brought Gundam in, it brought a huge influx of new fans, and sort of broke new ground for the franchise and renewed interest in the franchise after like ratings and stuff had started to decline over the course of the 90s. So it is a massively important Gundam show that I was really, really looking forward to rewatching and doing a podcast on, and I feel like rewatching it has been incredibly fun for me, and I'm very excited to do this podcast.
And it was quite a journey for me, I have to say. So if people have been, is this the part of the show where, Sean, I should give my initial reaction as the newbie?
Yeah, because once again, you know, the premise of the podcast is I've already watched all this stuff before, so I'm watching it for the second time. So I knew I liked Gundam SEED quite a bit upon first watching it. I mean, this has been like 5 years ago now. It's weird to think about how much time has actually passed, because it doesn't feel like that long since I originally watched all this stuff. About 5 years ago, I watched through it. Really liked it a lot. And then on my second viewing, I like it even more. I think the show does like a bunch of stuff that is incredibly smart that like you don't necessarily see unless you know everything of where it's going. But this was your first time watching it, Jonathan, so you had quite a journey. Based on your Twitter, you had quite a journey with Mobile Suit Gundam SEED. So how did it go for you? What were your feelings on this show?
I like Mobile Suit Gundam SEED. I like Mobile Suit Gundam SEED an awful lot, but it was a journey to get there. Mm-hmm. And my biggest lesson is I should just stop tweeting mid-show.
Yeah, that was sort of, I'll say that it was a weirdly stressful part of setting up this podcast where, like, as I was watching Gundam SEED, I'm like, oh my god, like, I remember liking this show, but I'm really into what it's doing. Like, it has problems, and we'll definitely talk about its problems. Like, it's certainly not a perfect show. But it's like, overall, I was really enjoying it. And then I started to see your tweets slowly turn a little bit as it was like, oh, I think Jonathan's maybe not liking this. And at a certain point, I'm like, Jonathan's really not liking this. And I was like, this is going to be a weird podcast if Jonathan does not like Gundam SEED and I like it this much. And like seeing that happen but it was a thing where it's like some of what you're tweeting, I had this reaction of like, but it's just, but you don't, but the show's going to do the exact thing that you're saying, but I can't tell you that because I don't want to affect your impressions of the show too much. So it was a very stressful being like, but no, you see, it's actually, they're going to do it. You just like give it like 5 or 10 more episodes that they're going to do the exact thing that you're saying, and it's going to be very good.
No, I should keep the faith. And, I will say, if you look at some of my tweets from like the first half of Gundam Seed, I'm playing it up a little bit. I was very punchy. It's a stressful time in the world when this is all going on. And so I was playing it up a little bit. But I would say the first 20-ish episodes, I was kind of down on. I thought it started strong because every Gundam show starts strong, and every Gundam show ends strong that we've talked about so far. That's just like universally true. Gundam Wing has the weakest ending, but even then, the Gundam Wing finale is one of its better episodes. So like, that's just a thing. So it started strong, and I do think I have legitimate criticisms that have not gone away about the pace of the first half. I think it's slow and a little meandering, and I think some of that is intentional, and I think some of it just feels messy to me. And it feels like it takes too long for new status quos to kind of come into place over what we're already watching. I think it taking 14 episodes to get to Earth is insane and takes way too long. But I think once they get to Earth, there's some stuff I like. And then I think the turning point for me is episode 23 or 24. It's whichever one is the takeoff on the 8th MS team, first episode, War for Two, where they even give it the same title. And that's the one where Othran, how do we say that name in English, Sean?
We'll talk about that in a little bit.
All right.
How we're going to deal with some of the names. Yeah.
I have to say, this is a show where I wish the subtitles just put all the names in katakana, because they are impossible to read in English. And like, I would constantly be looking up the names in katakana, and I'm like, what are they saying? Oh, Asuran. Okay, that's the weird spelling of that. Anyway, but it's the one where Asran and Kagali are together after the battle, and I was like, that's the one that made me sit up and go, that's a really good episode of Gundam. That's a good one. And it felt like it was doing something different. Like, even though it's taking off of the premise of the first 8th MS Team episode, it goes in a very different direction with it. And I thought, okay, this is good. This is new. I like this. And then at the end of the 20s, you get an episode literally called The Turning Point, which is the turning point, I think, like, qualitatively and thematically, which is where a big death happens, and it kind of... And I just, like, binged a bunch after that one that night, and I was like, okay, I'm into this now. And I think there was just this, it, like, snapped in my head, it started doing a bunch of the things I wanted it to do, and then I do think there are some, like, clear qualitative improvements. I think the pace snaps into place. I think it is better at characterization. I think the direction gets more confident as the show goes along. I think if you look at the first half, some of the action is very lax and not that inspired, and I think it gets better. I think the soundtrack adds a bunch of new tracks around the midway point that are phenomenal. It starts using a bunch of insert songs. There's just, like, a bunch of things that get better. But also, as I watched that second half, which I think is outstanding, I think the second half of Gundam Seed is one of the better stretches of certainly non-Tomino Gundam. It's just fantastic. But it did make me go back and look at the first half again, and I am excited to one day do my rewatch of this, Sean, because I think I would probably like that first half substantially more. Like I said, I think some of my criticisms stand, but there were also other things, specific complaints I had revolving around character motivation, that now that I see the full picture, I'm like, okay, I should have just kept the faith. This is Gundam. Gundam will generally lead me the right way. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where that second half can't land the way that it does if the first half is not doing its job, right?
Yeah.
It's like, because it is very much a show of two halves in a way I think we haven't really had with a Gundam. We definitely have, like, G Gundam has its sort of, like, big split in the middle where you go to the Hong Kong tournament, but that's less of the, like, we're doing, like, a diligent narrative setup that we're doing all the payoff for. Gundam Seed is very much the first half is this, like, pressure cooker, that they throw all the characters under this intense pressure cooker that they just put pressure and pressure and pressure, specifically on Kita, but on everybody, as Kita constantly is making the wrong choice, and he's making the wrong choice, the wrong choice, the wrong choice, because he can't see that there is any other choice. Until eventually you hit the turning point breaks him, and you have what is, I think, one of my favorite moments in any Gundam show ever is, like, when Kita makes his return in the Freedom Gundam, and it's, like, that sense of, like, catharsis the show is able to deliver on, entirely because it has been so diligent in setting up its themes and setting up the character dynamic and setting up this like sense of entrapment that these characters cannot escape this sort of like box that they have been put into, and then finally Kita like breaks free of it. Like that I think is a demonstration that I agree with you that the first half definitely has like some pacing issues. It could have accelerated some of that stuff. It's got like definitely like aesthetic and directorial problems in that first half that they I think solve in the second half more. But I think the core of the show is like really sort of nailing the job it has to do in that first half to then like deliver a second half that is so consistently just like triumphantly good as Gundam Seed has.
Yeah, no, I mean, the second, I would say from, like, that, so you have, I liked episode 23, and then you have this recap at 26, and 27 is kind of also a recap episode, but it's got a little bit of new stuff in it, and then once you're past that point, like, after episode 27, you are off to the races, and I don't think there's anything approaching a subpar episode past that point. It's just,
no.
Those last 22 episodes or so are phenomenal.
Absolutely, yeah. It is a really great show. I'm very, very excited to dive into it.
Yeah. Well, why don't you give us our history lesson, because I'm sure there's some interesting stuff to say about a show that became a genuine phenomenon in its home country and some places abroad.
Yeah, so I mean the broad look at what the history of the show is that it very much its mission statement was to be the 21st century Gundam, right? So you had Turn A Gundam starts airing in 1999, finishes airing in 2000, and then they have like more or less like a year off where they're not doing a TV Gundam or like not even in production on it. And then Sunrise starts to go into production on a new TV Gundam. They had kind of the Gundam franchise in terms of its TV presence, like the OVAs were doing well at this time, but the TV presence over the course of the 90s, starting with Victory Gundam, like the ratings like were not where they were. I have like, it's very hard to find numbers, like, because I've been trying to do it for a while, and I finally found something that seems like fairly reliable in terms of like broad rating numbers, where the original Mobile Suit Gundam did okay. It had 5.3%. Zeta Gundam is 6.6% average rating, which is like, that's good. Double Zeta is 6.1%. Victory Gundam is 3.9. So it's like you start to see it going down. G Gundam and Gundam Wing are 4.1 and 4.3, so it's a little bit better than Victory, but not super high. Afterward Gundam X is just like... Afterward Gundam X got completely fucked in the ratings, partially because it got moved to different channels. So like it's not even... The ratings don't even matter for that show because it just got completely boned. And then Turn A Gundam had 3%. So Turn A Gundam was, while like a critical darling, was not particularly well watched. Gundam Seed goes back up to basically Zeta Gundam numbers and is 6.1%. So Gundam Seed, and like some of the early episodes in particular, I think just had like some of the highest ratings that of any Gundam episode ever. So Gundam Seed like immediately solves this rating problem and kind of turns it around of what Gundam just had not been catching on in the 90s. I think part of that is the impact of EVA, where I don't think there's not a lot of like really strong EVA influence in Gundam Seed, but I think you can see around the edges the fact that it's a little bit more frank with sexuality. Like it has a sex scene, or at least a heavily implied sex scene that in the movie version is more explicit between Kita and Flay, and some of that kind of stuff that like EVA kind of rehabilitates a little bit of that anime market and then makes it more profitable. But also the mission statement for Gundam Seed, in order to kind of turn some of that around, was to really try to start fresh and to make a new entry point for new fans of Gundam, and not to try to make a show that is like designed to appeal to old Gundam fans. So to do that, they brought in a guy, Mitsuo Fukuda, who is the director and kind of like the brain behind Gundam Seed and its sequel, Seed Destiny. And he had done a bunch of stuff for Sunrise over the years. The main thing he was known for was a sort of like mecha racing type show called Future GPX Cyber Formula, which I believe some of the OVAs of that did come over here on Toonami, because Cyber Formula, the first TV show, 50-episode show, started airing in 1991, and then over the course of the 90s, he basically directed a bunch of OVA spin-offs of that one series. And those were very successful. And he had done a couple of other like super robot shows, like a guy who had done a bunch of stuff for Sunrise, had never really worked on Gundam before outside of, I think they pulled him in on Victory Gundam for like one episode as like hey, we need someone to help work on this. Like you like get in here and do some of the storyboards for this episode. But other than that, he was not a Gundam guy. So they pulled him in, and sort of had him and a team that was composed of a lot of people who had done Gundam stuff all through with Sunrise, but he was new to it. Sort of devise, what do you want to do for a new Gundam show? And Fukuda, along with his writing partner, his long-term writing partner who worked on like most of the stuff that he did, Chiaki Motosawa, who's also his wife, there's like a husband-wife writing team. They got together and sort of brainstormed kind of some of the big stuff they wanted to tackle. One of the things they wanted to do, and that Sunrise wanted, was for Gundam to sort of recalibrate its target audience, because it had never been particularly good at hitting the demographic it was supposed to be hitting. Like, even when it was very popular with Tomino shows, it was hugely successful, but it was hugely successful in an older demographic than what they were really aiming for, because the shows are supposed to be, like, not quite kids' cartoons, but they're supposed to hit that, like, older elementary, middle school, young high school. Like, that's like you want that kind of like 10 to 14-ish bracket in there is like where the kind of money spot. And so they wanted, hey, we really want to hit that target audience. So they designed the show to kind of hit that a little bit more. They also specifically designed the show to try to appeal more to a female audience, which was extremely successful. It's like Seed, Gundam Wing, and Iron Blooded Orphans are the only Gundam shows to have like a huge appeal with a female audience, and Gundam Seed, I think, of those three, has the biggest. I think it maybe has more in that popularity poll of female fans that voted for it than male fans that voted for it. So some of the stuff they did to try to get that appeal and kind of change it and update it, they pulled a lot of influence from different fictional sources, and they pulled influences from real-world events that were happening at the time. So some of the fictional influences they pulled from were shoujo manga. So a lot of like the romance tropes you get, the sort of like friendly, like this sort of like bitter friend thing between Kira and Athrun is very much this like BL, boys love manga thing, that it's like very like we're friends, but we're also have to be enemies, and there's like this like sort of subtle romantic attraction between them that is like very potent for the doujin or like fan-made manga market that is very popular with female otaku. So it's very much a like, hey, like if you want to make your fan comic about how Kira and Athrun are really in love and like do all that stuff, they very much designed some of those male relationships to appeal to that kind of dynamic. That was very popular and was and continues to be a very popular fan trend in anime. As well as then injecting a lot of like romance drama and like teen drama into the actual plotting. That's very reminiscent of shoujo manga and shoujo anime. So all the stuff of like the love triangle between Kira, Flay, and Sai, and the like weird sort of like sibling thing between Kira and Kagari, and then she gets with Athrun, and then you have Lacus, and there's like a lot of sort of like complex relationship drama that happens over the course of the show. Much more of a focus on that than in any previous Gundam, where the most you have is like Amuro is in love with an older woman. That's never going to happen with Matilda. Or you have this like just like straight romance thing in G Gundam. This is much more like you could imagine it just being set in a high school with these characters and having the exact same relationship dynamics as Gundam Seed has. They also Fukuda pulls a lot of influence from different kind of Western stuff that he was really into. So there's some Star Trek influence here. A lot of the coordinator and natural stuff comes from Khan from Star Trek, because it's the same sort of premise as here, genetically modified humans and a conflict between genetically modified humans and normal, quote-unquote, human beings. There's some pretty clear Star Wars stuff in the Kira Kagari, like, twins separated at birth that, like, have a weird sort of romantic seeming attraction, and then you realize they can't because they have to be siblings, and it's like, okay, that solves the love triangle, is that we are secret siblings, like, the most solid, we can't have the love triangle excuse possible to separate out your romantic pairs very cleanly in the end of your show. So they kind of borrow that mechanic from Star Wars, as well as the double-bladed lightsaber from 1999's Phantom Menace, that it is the only time a double-bladed beam saber appears in Gundam is in the Seed and Seed Destiny stuff, and it very much places this show exactly in the early 21st century, which I like a lot. And so, yeah, so a lot of that, like, influence in there, as well as an explicit attempt and, like, a clear attempt and specific attempt by Fukuda to design the first half of the show as a broad homage to the big plot arcs of the original Mobile Suit Gundam. So it is not one-to-one, and I think, and we'll talk about when we're breaking it down, like where they'd make differences and what that says about the show. That's very interesting. But like especially very clearly the early stuff of them being on the colony and the way that like Zaft infiltrates the colony and that whole setup, the dynamic of this is a Earth Federation versus the space people story, and it's very straight one of those. And then a lot of the here's are like vague Ramba Ral-esque equivalent, that kind of stuff. Like it was designed to homage and reference and build from similar plot arcs from the original Gundam, and then divert at some point in part of its mission to be the 21st century Gundam and this sort of entry point for new fans. The other stuff that it pulled from that I think is interesting to think about is, so this show started airing in 2002. It would have gone into pre-production like planning stages in late 2001. So this is the first Gundam that's made after 9/11. So 9/11 is an inspiration in terms of some of the world building stuff. So the Bloody Valentine incident in Gundam Seed is a vague sort of inspiration, or is vaguely inspired by 9/11. Like, but since the show came out 2002 to 2003, it doesn't have any of the, like, to give the historical context, like that's before America invaded Iraq. That is like before specific claims of like weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Or at least that stuff started happening after the show was already airing. So it is not really an Iraq war show, and it'll be interesting to talk about that with 00 Gundam, which is like the first one that is like a Gundam that is like informed by what like warfare looked like in the Iraq war. But this is definitely sort of pulling a little bit from the like the global tensions and anxieties around this sense of impending warfare caused from 9/11, in the sense of like hate in the world. That was the fallout from 9/11. That is very much a big inspiration in the construction of Gundam Seed, as well as the classic early 21st century sci-fi thing of like GMOs and like genetically modified organisms and cloning and stuff, where there's a lot of stuff. If you think of like the old X-Men movies and the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man, where they make the spider genetically modified instead of nuclear, right? Like there's a lot of stuff at that point where people are like, oh no, like we're what are we doing? We're messing with God's plan. We're making clones, because some of that technology was like starting to happen. And I just feel like it is always something that really dates an early piece of 21st century sci-fi with how much it focuses on that thing. Because that was definitely a like slightly ripped from the headlines concern that I think is something that like nowadays we don't really think about, but was a very prominent sci-fi theme in the early 21st century. So they kind of put all that stuff together, put together a really great team, like some really strong musical artists that they put together for it as well, like TM Revolution and what's the name of, like Fiction Junction and the associated creators of that band to create some really sick music for this as well. So they just they really went out there with some strong inspirations and a really strong focus on what they were trying to hit, and they fucking completely nailed it, because it absolutely, the popularity of Gundam completely resurged after this, and without Gundam Seed, like I don't know what 21st century Gundam would look like, because Gundam Seed being so successful is 100% what like paves the pathway for the 00 Gundam to come out, and Iron Blooded Orphans, and like all of what we think of as Gundam now. Like Gundam Seed is the show that kind of created the scenario that allows, if Gundam Seed was the seed from which modern Gundam is sprouts, basically, is what I am saying, to use the full cliche metaphor.
I think the name you were looking for there also was Toshihiko Sahashi, who's the composer of the show, who who is a big anime guy. Would go on to do all the Full Metal Panic, all the Hunter x Hunter, all the Hunter Hunter. I know I have not watched it, so I always see Hunter x Hunter, and then people who have seen Hunter Hunter tell me you don't say the X, and I'm like, that's fucking weird. But there you go. Anyway, but yes.
Yeah. So I was thinking of him. I was also thinking of Yuki Kajiura, who is the singer, and we'll go into that when we go into the music, but she's like a singer and like composer that also worked on most of the insert songs and stuff like that. And we'll talk about her, but she's very fucking cool.
Yeah. The other major innovation of Gundam Seed that I'm sure we'll focus a lot on in this episode, Sean, but I wondered if you had anything to add here in terms of the production, is this is the first digitally animated Gundam. There clearly was some digital ink and paint in the 90s, but this is the first one done completely digitally and in standard definition. So all of the 80s, 90s Gundam, all of that stuff up through Turn A is on Blu-ray and looks absolutely gorgeous because there are film elements that you can go back to and restore, particularly Turn A, which was done entirely by hand and entirely on 35 millimeter. But this one is standard definition and locked in that. There is the special edition that they did, the HD remaster, that we did not watch for this show. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But the original version of this was 4:3, and not only is there not a high definition version of it, there cannot be. It's a standard definition animated show at 480p.
Yeah. This is one of those where there's so much stuff that goes into the history of Gundam Seed. It's easy to forget, yes, that it is the first full, what is called in Japan VTR or digital. So it was basically on videotape, right? Because this is 2002. So yeah, full digital, and it's something where it definitely, it is one of, I think, the reasons why you can really see that qualitative change in the animation around the midpoint of the show, is it's clear that the team is getting better at using the resources there.
Yeah.
Because the space early in Gundam Seed and all the stuff set in space early in Gundam Seed looks really bad. When they go back to space, it looks so much better because they have figured out way better, I think, how to use backgrounds and stuff like that. But yeah, it is the first Gundam show that has full digital. It's very much, you can see in Turn A Gundam where it starts, right? Because Turn A Gundam has a lot more of those like digital elements and like digitally manipulating different elements of the frame or different cells to do things that, like, I think is the most dated aspect of Turn A Gundam, that otherwise is a very timeless looking show. And then occasionally you get this like weird thing where the like Mobile Suit Gundam, or like the Gundam cell, just sort of stretches and enlarges in this very digital way that you're like, that looks wrong, and it does not fit with the rest of the aesthetic of this show. And so, yeah, it's very much a show that is built entirely out of this digital aesthetic, that I think is, it makes sense why they go in that direction. I think it really hurts the first half of the show, and Gundam Seed I don't think ever looks particularly good. And to that end, they did the HD remaster for the 10-year anniversary of Gundam Seed, which we will talk about a couple of the changes they made. And I think, and probably most people listening to this, unless you watched the original Gundam Seed when it was coming out, either in Japan or because the original Gundam Seed was dubbed and released in America. So unless you watched those versions, or you went specifically out of your way to watch the original airing of Gundam Seed, you will have watched the HD remaster, which is a totally fine way to watch the show. But for the purposes of this podcast, we wanted to do the original version for a couple of reasons.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I mean, if you watch the original version, and if you are our age, we're both 28. You're almost 28. And you grew up in like the early 2000s and watched Toonami and stuff, it will feel like a warm bath of nostalgia, even if the animation isn't that good, because this is what 2000s anime looked like. The Digimation, the early like digital ink and paint stuff for anime has a very specific look. Anime also just, I think, seemingly got really cheap for a couple of years there. And there's just like less animation in your anime. I think some shows pulled it off better than others. Like, I think there's some shows where that aesthetic helps it. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one of those for me that, like, I cannot imagine with actual, like, good HD animation. And there are ones that it really hurts, and I think Seed, in parts, is one of those. But I agree with you, Sean. I also think the second half just... And I was wondering if that was just me getting used to it, or if it was they got better, and I'm glad that you agree with me. It's not just an illusion in my head, because it definitely feels like they get
100% get better. Like, if you compare it, it's like you can just see that they do the backgrounds in space differently, because the first half of the show, the space just looks fuzzy and weird, and like it just doesn't look, the backgrounds look wrong. And they definitely, it's like most of what the stuff they were doing was just completely new for this team. Like this, because this whole team at Sunrise had never done a show like this before. So it's not just for Gundam, it was for the people making it.
Yeah.
The first time they had done something like this.
Well, I mean, that's why all of these shows have like a thing about early 2000s anime is the colors are just really loud and garish. Mm-hmm. And in a way they were not before. And then I think with the switch to HD got better again, and now is not a problem anymore. But like early digital coloring was just like, the anime industry could not figure out how to like make it nuanced and not so loud. And I think Gundam Seed does get better at it, and I think some of it, like, they lean into, like, the eyes and the hair and stuff, but some of it does, like, that's just something that makes it look kind of cheaper. But that was, again, that is not a Gundam Seed-specific problem. This was the entire industry went through this. So, yeah.
Yeah. So where do you want to go, Jonathan? How should we tackle this? Because I feel like there's so much to talk about with Gundam Seed.
There
Um,
is.
yeah.
I want to start with the first half, and I want to start with how it borrows the original, 0079 Gundam structure.
All right.
Because obviously there's a lot of that. It starts with the same sort of general setup of you start on a colony where you have a group of friends and a shy, lonely boy, and then a weird dude in a mask invades the colony and does some bad shit with mobile suits, and then the lonely boy gets in the mobile suit, and then there is some fights and rivalry. They wind up on a ship where the entire crew, it's a big experimental ship, the Archangel, which is just the white base. Like, its external design is almost a dead ringer for the white base. And the entire crew dies, and so there's a new young plucky captain, and they have adventures, and they eventually get to Earth, and when they get to Earth, you even have the thing of, they get off of their course, and so they land on the wrong continent, and then there's a long time for them there trying to get to the Earth base. So basically, this follows the original Gundam formula up through Jaburo, which is Alaska in this show, which I think is a fun change there. But them trying to get to Alaska, the one big thing there is no equivalent to in that range of episodes, I would say, is the big battle. What's it called in the original Gundam? The something day.
Odessa Day.
Odessa Day. There's no equivalent to Odessa Day in this. But other than that, it follows all of those major beats, but with the big differences of there is more focus on the Zeon side, which in this is Zaft. In terms of you have Othran as your sort of other protagonist. I think if you're watching this for the first time, it's not clear how important Othran will be in the second half, but he is there more than equivalent pilots in the original series in a lot of ways. And your Char equivalent is actually there a lot less. Le Creuset is, or however you say his name, is less present in the first half of this show than I would say Char is in Gundam. So you have those sorts of things. And that is the general setup for the show. And I think part of my sort of negative reaction to the first half of the show, I don't care if it's borrowing those elements because it's doing it very consciously. And it doesn't just feel like an empty ripoff. I think it's doing interesting things. And I think one of the things I want to talk about, Sean, that I think is really clear in those first episodes is that this is the first Gundam ever made that is made specifically for people who haven't seen Gundam before. And I think that choice of audience is really interesting, and I think has a lot of cool stuff in there. I do think the show gets slow in that first half. I think the first 14 episodes get very formulaic, where every episode sort of winds up being Kira and Othran having to fight in some way, there being no clear outcome to their fight, and then they go away. And it's a very static dynamic in the way, original Gundam does that for 5 episodes with Amuro and Char, but before it gets old, they jump into the new dynamic with Garma Zabi, and then by the time you get to episode 10, Garma is gone and you get to Ramba Ral, and it just goes through things much faster. It's one of the great things about that show. I think Seed in its early going is reluctant to switch status quos, and I think that hurts it. But it's very clearly doing a lot of character setup and work there, and I think the stuff with Flay and some of the romance and sexual stuff in the show I did find interesting, even when I wasn't all that hot on it. But yeah, that's sort of the opening salvo of broadly talking about the first half of the show that I want to get into.
Yeah, because I think it's interesting that it is broadly very similar, but there are a couple really massive differences. One of which Othran being the main one, who has the most unpronounceable name. I have been living with this name for 5 years, so I feel like I can just say Othran and be okay with it.
Yes.
But it is definitely one that in English, Athrun, that Athra, that's that is a very awkward sound that in Japanese is Asadan. That is much easier. But I assume they just didn't want to call him Aslan, which is basically what it would be if you just made it a much simpler transliteration of his name in Japanese, and he'd just be Jesus Lion Man, basically.
Yes.
And that would be I'd be fine with that, but I guess they just didn't want to go that direction.
What do they call him in the dub? Is it just Athran?
I think they do. They just try to go Othran, I think is how they try to say it. Yeah, the dub, because I did watch some clips of it, not even entirely on purpose, but it was mostly because it was what my player defaulted to.
Yeah, me too.
So it was just oh god, or because the dub aired in 2004 for basically 2004 to 2005, and it's that's a rough whew, that's a rough time for anime dubs. So if you,
I watched a little
yeah.
bit of it. To be fair, it's extremely faithful. So like it's you're not missing any story stuff, but the voices are very like early. It's Cartoon Network vibes all the way down.
It's I think the localization stuff is fine. It's just like the voice acting style just does not fit the show at all. And it's just like it feels like a cartoon performances rather than anime performances, which are going for something slightly more dramatic feeling.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
Anyway,
I forget.
you were talking
So
about Othran
Othran,
as like the big deviation point from the Gundam formula.
where and it sets up what the show is doing, and like its main difference from Mobile Suit Gundam is that Mobile Suit Gundam is not really concerned with having Amuro be like a capital H hero, right? He's not someone who's going to solve the war. He's not someone who's going to save the day. He's not someone that's going to get he's not someone who's going to try to like stand above and beyond the war and figure out the causes of the war and try to solve those. He's a boy fighting in the war, and he does not have power to change anything outside of it. And it's very much the tack that show takes, and it works great for Mobile Suit Gundam. What Gundam Seed is interested is in something very different. It's way more interested in, let's like take a step back and look at the war from like a big perspective, something that Tomino does in his later shows like Zeta, but doesn't do in Mobile Suit Gundam. And says, what if we take that kind of like more straight war story and do that and step back further and give us an anchor in both sides. Like, it is definitely more Kira's show than Othran, but Othran occupies a lot of interest in time for the show, and the show really like invests in him and his supporting cast really heavily. That pays off so much once you get to that middle point in the second half. And it's really interested in that, and the dynamic of the show is way less about the dynamic for the show from Kira's perspective is way less about Kira desperately trying to fight to survive and like survive himself, right? Which is like Amra's motivation for most of that early part of Gundam, is he's just trying to live, and that's it. Like, everything else is like way beyond his concern. Kira is trying to protect his friends, which includes Othran, right? Like, he's trying not to hurt anybody. He's trying to keep his friends alive. But I feel like you're never in that like desperation mode for personal survival that you are with Amuro, because Kira is such a powerful character right from the jump, right? He is a coordinator. He is, he's basically effectively a Superman type character, where you're never particularly concerned for Kira's safety, because you generally feel outside of like that middle point where he and Othran are actually trying to kill each other. You never typically feel like Kira is in like threat of like himself dying or losing in these fights in that early part of the show, because he's just so capable so immediately. But you're worried about, will he be able to protect the thing that he's trying to protect, in the way that Superman's the anxiety or the plot tension around the Superman story isn't about, will Superman survive this fight and be able to like stop Lex Luthor and put him in jail. It's, will he be able to stop Lex Luthor before Lex Luthor kills like these 10,000 people or whatever on this boat, or whatever the plot of the episode or the story is. And that's way more the dynamic they go for with Gundam Seed, which puts it really quickly in a very different bucket in terms of the way that it's looking at and treating war than the way that Mobile Suit Gundam is. We're putting Kira, this character who should have the power to do way more than what he's doing, but he just doesn't know how to do it or what to do with his power, and we're putting more and more pressure on him until eventually he kind of cracks in that middle portion of the show. And so I find that like different dynamic with the protagonist and the different perspective on the protagonist really compelling in this first half of the show.
Yeah, and I think I would be, like I said, I would really like to watch this show again, because I am coming to this from seeing it once, and I enjoyed that part of it. But for me, it also was like getting buried in some of the pacing issues we can talk about. But also, and this is something I don't like fully think is a flaw, having seen the full thing, but some of it I do think is, of like, I had an issue with like understanding character motivation in this first half very much. And I actually think that's intentional. I think the show is making Kira's motivation a little murky. And I think if it cannot be fully vocalized, it's because Kira can't fully vocalize it. Like, one of the things for me was like, this show is missing, and at first I thought this was a bad thing, and now I would say I think it's intentional that they don't do this. But it is missing the equivalent moment from Mobile Suit Gundam episode 12, I think it is, where Garma's funeral happens, and they're all on the white base watching the Zabi family and the entire nation of Zeon going, Sheik Zeon, right? And they are afraid, and they're like, oh my god, this is what we're up against. And you're seeing the full force of, like, this is the enemy, and that is why, like, we're going to humanize them. It's not that they dehumanize the Zeon characters. Right in that area, you're getting Ramba Ral for the first time, right? But it is Amuro fighting for Earth, even if Earth isn't perfect, is the right thing to do, because look at these fucking guys, right? That's something Gundam does really well in laying out, and also in the backstory that they fucking, colony dropped on Earth, right? So, like, there's an establishment of how bad they are. In this show, you have Kira kind of defaults to being with the Earth Forces group because that's the ship that picks him up, and that's where his friends are. But there is no sense of a bigger ideology of, like, well, what is Zaft doing that is so bad that Kira would ideologically align himself with Earth? And in fact, we don't see that. We don't see what the equivalent of Zaft. We do in the recap episode, and I'll talk about that in a second. We get a little bit of that, but it's nowhere near as bad as, like, a colony drop or something, and it's arguably not as bad as anything Earth has done to Zaft. And so you have a much more equal distribution where, like, the badness of the Earth forces is highlighted right away in Gundam Seed in a way it is not necessarily in the original Gundam. And so you have this problem of motivation where you understand where Othran is coming from, because he is a coordinator, he is of Zaft, he is a believer in the cause. Kira is someone who is sort of fighting by default, and that frustrated me in so much as I found Kira very opaque, and I found his motivations hard to buy into, because it felt like he was, like I said, kind of just fighting by default because this is the ship that picked him up and he doesn't want his friends to die. And I was thinking, man, that's not enough to carry a show. And it's not, and they know that. And, like, that is very important. And I think this is what you were saying earlier, Sean, when you said you wanted to, like, tweet at me, Jonathan, they're going to do everything you're saying, don't worry about it. Because they do. Like, I think it's a lot of, like, Kira is kind of fighting by default. He's following the script that has been laid out. And when you talk about the pressure cooker situation, I think a lot of the reactions I was having to the show as a longtime Gundam, there's kind of two things here. As a longtime Gundam fan, it's not in my life, I've only been watching the show for 2 years now, but as I've seen a lot of Gundam, and other people would have too, I am reacting to these things in a way I think they want you to react to and to be questioning, because Kira is also questioning, and that sets up the second half. But I also think if you were a new viewer, and again, coming back to, I think this show is explicitly pitched, not only, it's not saying if you've watched other Gundam, don't watch Seed, but I do think its first primary audience is someone who's never seen Gundam. And I think if you've never seen Gundam, a lot of that stuff about motivation would possibly come through stronger because you don't you're not holding up Kira to Amuro, you're not thinking about the Zeon connection, you would kind of just see it for what it is. So that's a way of saying one of my primary problems with that half that I don't think is a problem, and I think actually the way it is playing on expectation and reality is really interesting. But that was something that was, like, bothering me about the show, and we'll talk about it at length. The breakaway from, like, apathy and acting by default to actively trying to change large-scale structures is what this show is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, it is a show where within this show, Earth is the bad guy, right? Like this is not a show, because in Mobile Suit Gundam, the original Mobile Suit Gundam, you get the vague sense of, like, man, like, the Earth Federation government isn't all that great, but the show doesn't actually deal with it particularly directly. There's a little bit more of it in the movies, in the third movie, but it doesn't really, like, go into that, right? And Amuro and the people of the White Base are fighting with Earth and on the Earth side. And it's not until you get to Zeta Gundam where they start to sort of more question, well, maybe the Zabis were extremists, but also, like, space independence is a, like, just cause to fight for the space noids, right? Like, the Earth Federation government does suck. It is corrupt. It does have these problems. And that's something that Tomino sort of goes and explores in later shows, not in the original one. But Gundam Seed is very much kind of like, what if we took some of those dynamics in Zeta Gundam and put them and kind of merged them in with with the original Gundam show. So you have this sense of, throughout that first section, that, like, everything going on with the Earth government fucking sucks from the jump. Like, and it's way worse, I think, than even the way that all the stuff happens in the original Mobile Suit Gundam, where like the way that everyone gets kind of roped into being on the Archangel so aggressively by Ramius is like way more objectionable and like probably a war crime than what happens with Amuro and Bright and all those people, right? Like, she literally holds them at gunpoint and says, you have seen a military secret, like, you are going to help me and you're going to get on here and do this shit, or you are going to be fucking executed. So fucking get to it, children, right? And it's like, and you understand Ramius has her reasons for having to do that and trying to survive, but it's like immediately clear that this scenario is way less like, well, there's some problems with the Earth Federation, but we've got to go along with it because it's like, no, like, this is fucked up. And then repeatedly, as you're seeing them encounter more and more Earth Federation people, with the exception of the one guy who was like the origin of the Archangel Project, who dies in like the Earth Entry episode. He's like the only Earth guy who seems like he's maybe okay, and he's like trying to actually like get something like done. Generally speaking, when you encounter Earth Federation people in that first section, they're like real fuckers.
There is no Matilda. There is no...
Yeah.
What's Matilda's husband's name?
Woody.
Woody, yeah. There is no Woody Taicho. There's none of that. It's just... It's these assholes. It seems vaguely fascist and secretive, and in the recap episode, when you learn the backstory, it's like, holy shit, they committed the war crime to end all war crimes. Like, this is bad.
Yeah, they're fucking bad guys. And I do also like that... they establish in the like equivalent of the Moon episode from Mobile Suit Gundam, where they go to that other base, that it's also there in this world. The Earth Federation is not one like unified political entity. It's more like, seems like it's vaguely like NATO or the UN, that it's some sort of like treaty and alliance, but there you have like the Eurasian side of the Federation, which is very different than the Atlantic side of the Federation, right? Like, they are, generally speaking, working together, but there are multiple factions that exist within the Earth Federation. And you have that when he goes to the equivalent, like that asteroid or whatever it's called, I think Artemis, they call it. Like the guy there who tries to like get Kita on his side and be like, hey, you're a coordinator, like, who's betrayed all the coordinators. Why don't you join us? And like, you'll be really valuable. Like, come to like the Eurasian side and like do all this, and we'll like buy you basically off of the Archangel. It's clear that everything is not equal, right? It's not just like one massive unified Earth faction. That there are lots of other factions that exist, and it's like the most extreme faction that has the I always forget the name of like the blue whatever people.
Blue Cosmos.
The Blue Cosmos, the terrorists basically who did the Blue Bloody Valentine Day, the terrorist racists. They are the faction that slowly like takes control as you go to the second half of the show.
It's kind of like the EU. You know, you got Germany trying to hold down the fort, keep people sane. You got the UK over here shitting its pants. You know, it's a messy coalition that is losing its fucking mind.
Yeah, and there's something about that messiness I like, and it's that like kind of murkiness you get in that first section of the show, where it's like, you say like Kita doesn't have a strong motivation. Like, he specifically doesn't have an ideological motivation to fight. Like, he has no ideology that he's pushing. He's just trying to protect his friends, and he doesn't want anybody to die. So it's like he's trying to fight and like not kill Othron or anyone else, and like not let his friends get killed. And I find that dynamic of it very interesting, where he just seems to have no real self-awareness of like the dynamics of war. Like, he doesn't seem to have a consciousness of him being on the quote unquote Earth side, or him being on he's on the side of the naturals, even though he's a coordinator, right? Because when people say, it's like, why are you doing this even though you're a coordinator? Or the guy says like, you're a traitor to the coordinators. Kita like doesn't, he like understands what they mean in terms of, he understands what the words mean, but he doesn't have like a awareness of that is something that he's doing, because he doesn't see the sides in that way, right? He doesn't see the coordinators and naturals as being two things that are like completely separate, that they have to be opposed sides. And so he lacks that consciousness, even though that's how literally everybody else, every other character other than Lacus, is operating in the show, by this clear assumption about naturals and coordinators. Kita has no consciousness of that, and it causes a lot of that pressure cooker scenario where he's trying to solve a situation from a position that is unsolvable, where you cannot like fix this sort of conflict between these two sides if you are actively picking one side and fighting for them, which is what he's doing when he's with the Archangel.
Yes. And it was also creating a pressure cooker in my brain and on my Twitter feed, because I've been anxious a lot lately, and when I'm anxious, I tweet, where, like, everything you were just saying, Sean, was driving me up a fucking wall and making me tear my hair out, because I'm like, what is this kid doing? What's going on? And the thing is, I think to a certain degree, that's kind of what they want you to do, especially if you know the formula they're playing with, because that war is also happening inside Kira. He is less passive than he appears to be, and he's actually extremely active in the second half. In the second half, he's one of the most active and least reactive Gundam protagonists, whereas in the first half, he is purely reactive, and that is a problem. And if you are watching it like I was, tearing your hair out, you're supposed to be. Because there is a big moment in the middle when you get to the turning point, and when he fucking murders a little kid, and when he realizes what has happened and what role he can actually play. It is this incredible catharsis that I agree with you, Sean. If the first half weren't putting the planks down, and I don't think it puts them down perfectly, and I think we agree on that, it wouldn't land, though. You wouldn't get to that place of, like, the catharsis of Kira choosing a new path. You have to see the old path, and you have to see that that path is frustrating and is wrong. And I think they do that very well.
Yeah. There's a couple of, like, moments or episodes from this section of the show I kind of want to zoom in on
Yeah.
that I think are quite good. Because you have, like, episode 7 and then the following couple of episodes, which is where Locus comes into it. So episode 7 is the one where they end up at the ruins of Junia 7, which is the colony or the plant, as they call them now, that instead of being big cylinders, they're like big hourglasses, that was nuked by Blue Cosmos. And sort of, it's like the vague 9/11 equivalent, right? That sparked the whole war. And they end up there to go and, like, have to basically salvage giant chunks of ice as water. And that's, I think, one of the best episodes in this early section where I think it really zooms in on that internal strife within Kita, where it is like what they are doing is, and I think it is something where I suspect in the original context, again, if you're thinking this happens between 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, like, even if you're in Japan, obviously you don't have, like, you know, the direct connection to 9/11 in America, but 9/11 was a thing that impacted, like, global politics tremendously. And so, like, in that original context, like, the idea of going back to the site of that kind of tragedy and basically scavenge it for supplies is, like, it's like an uncomfortable idea. And I think I like the, like, reaction that all the crew have to be like, this seems kind of fucked up what we're doing. And then you have that moment where they're, like, getting, like, one of the pods is getting, like, a big chunk of ice, and Kita's in the strike trying to protect it. And he sees a Zaft Jin, their mobile suit, like, kind of slowly coming towards it, and he's hiding and pointing the gun, and he's just like, please, just stop, just turn around, just stop, I don't want to do this, I don't want to have to kill you. And he's just waiting and waiting and waiting, and then eventually the thing, like, sees the pod that's grabbing the ice, and Kita has no choice, he has to shoot it, kills the pilot, and then he rescues Locus, who is in the, like, little escape pod. And I think that episode just, like, is so tense, and I think the imagery of them in this just massive debris field filled with, like, old houses and, like, all the shit that's just floating out there in space is really effective. And is, like, it's one of those moments here that, like, there's no equivalent to it in the original Mobile Suit Gundam. Like, this episode is totally unique. It doesn't have, like, I can point to, this is basically the Moon episode from the original Mobile Suit Gundam. It is one of those, like, this is just a very uniquely Gundam Seed episode to me.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think it's of this early run, and I'll say, like, on the pacing issue, I just think, particularly for the initial space section, I'm looking at, like, the list here of episodes, and there's a bunch of events I really love in this section that I did genuinely enjoy. The one you're pointing to is a highlight, but I think a lot of the other things that I'm sure we'll come to I like. It's just that it feels like, to borrow a phrase from Bilbo Baggins, butter stretched over too much bread, where I think it's too many episodes, and a lot of episodes, to me, like, I think one of the things I tweeted is, like, I feel like every 2 episodes should be 1 episode, and that's because a lot of these episodes would end in a place where I'm like, that feels like the act break of an episode, and I would just keep going, and then after the act break, there would be the rest of this story. And I do think it's just a little long, and the basic status quo of, you know, Le Creuset's team chasing the Archangel, and Othran and Kira and the other people on Othran's team continuing to fight with no actual like progression in the relationship is, I think, takes too long as a status quo. I do think if I were to say one episode that feels like a good episode, I think the one you named is a good one, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think the biggest issue with the pacing is they probably needed like another minor antagonist to throw in here or something, just to like freshen that side of it up a little bit, because I think with on the Kira side of the show, they move through a lot of stuff, and I think they progress it really naturally.
Yeah.
But I do think it's like on the Raul Le Creuset and all those guys, like it's just you spend too much time seeing the same mobile suits fight the same mobile suits.
Well, it's kind of like in this equivalent time in the original Mobile Suit Gundam. By the time you're at episode 13, you have gone through the early Char episodes. You have killed Garma. You have killed Rambaral. Like you've moved through status quos. And I'm not saying other shows have to move that fast, because no other show moves that fast. But it is a little bit of like, by the time we get to Earth, I feel like there should have been some bigger shift in the character dynamics. And I agree, Kira gets several because Flay becomes the love interest. You have all the stuff with girl name Lacus, yes. I was about to say Kagali, and I'm like, we haven't met her yet, but Lacus, yes. All of that. But yeah, it leaves like Othran doesn't. It also leaves Othran's side of the show, I think, lacking in, like, to borrow another phrase from the show, phase shifts.
Yeah, actually, like mentioning Kagali just reminded me that it blew my mind rewatching this, that Kagali was in the first episode, because in my memory she pops up when you get to Earth, because she doesn't show up again for this whole stretch until you go to Earth. I was like, when I watched that first episode, I was like, wait, what the fuck? Holy shit! I did not even realize that she was so early in this.
Well, and that's another reason why I think it's too many episodes to get to Earth, because by the time you get to Kagali, it's like this big reveal. I'm like, I don't remember this person, and it was until they like did the full flashback, and I'm like, oh, okay. Well, it's been fucking. If you were watching this in real time, it's been like 4 months of this show airing. I just think it's a little long for them to wait to reintroduce that character. Although I'm sure if I rewatch it, I'd have the same reaction you do, Sean.
Yeah, but to look at like one of the things I really like in this section, so after episode 7, the Scar of Space, you have Lacus, and this is like, I think the biggest status quo shift in this section is when Lacus Clyne comes on board, and that's where you get a little bit more of this sort of insight, a little bit into like the Zaft side of stuff. You get Othran, and he has his relationship with Lacus, and you start to get some of that backstory. But this is, I think, one of the most rewarding parts of rewatching the show. One is seeing and like understanding the dynamic of like, oh, the Earth Federation is going to become the bad guys. Like Kira is going to have this big moment of catharsis, and you can see how that stuff's setting up, and the pressure on Kira as he keeps on sort of not realizing he's kind of fucking up by staying with the ship and doing all the stuff he's doing. But one of the other things you see is Lacus, who, when you now know, having watched it, that, oh, she is like the linchpin. She's the person who basically fucking ends the war, because she's the one who unifies the different factions together to create basically like this version of like the AU from Zeta Gundam. Like, she is so fucking cool, and it's really interesting rewatching her first few episodes where I think they do a really good job writing her character, and then the actress, I think it's Rie Tanaka, who I think this was her big breakout role. She's in a bunch of stuff now, but she wasn't in a lot of stuff back then. And the character is one where on first blush, she is the like very stereotypical like kind of princess, what you call an Ojo-sama type character, who she's kind of like an airhead, and she's very rich, and she just seems like she like lives in kind of her own world and all that kind of stuff. And she definitely has that quality to her, but it's very much a thing that she is putting on intentionally in almost like a Columbo-esque fashion to kind of put people off their guard. And you see a lot more of that once you know that that's who that character is, and that she has this like way kind of tougher kind of like military general side to her, that she is like kind of subtly manipulating people, and she has this like wisdom to her in her interactions with Kira that like start to plant the seeds. I hate that I have to use that word because it seems like it's a pun, but it's just a very common phrase. She plants the seeds of change for Kita's character in their interactions, because she's like the only other person he talks to who sees the world the same way he does, who understands that it's like, while people who are coordinators have been genetically modified and all that stuff, like that does not define everything about who you are as a person. And so she's on that same page and kind of helps Kita in that sense. And then you have that really great moment after Kita gives her back to Othran, and like Kita, it's one of the first times where Kita is now making an active choice that's kind of against the interests of the ship he's on. That sort of is that first window you get into, there's maybe another path that you could take, Kita, if you fully committed yourself here. And Lacus kind of shows him a little bit of that. And when he gives her back to Othran and they're going, and Raul Cruz rolls up and is about to attack the Archangel, she goes on the radio and is like, stand the fuck down, motherfucker. Like, no. You're going to shoot that ship right now? I'm right here. Like, get back to the ship. We're going home. Come on. And she just completely pulls rank on him and just like turns the whole thing around. And it is like such a great ending to that episode. Where like Le Creuset is just like totally emasculated by her, where she's just, and everyone else is so shocked by it. But it's like the first glimpse you get that there is way more going on with that character than first appears.
Yeah, that's actually something I would be really excited to rewatch the series for, because I'll admit I didn't really know what to make of Lacus in the early going. Not in a bad way, not in a I dislike this character. Honestly, I agree, I think that is a jolt of energy into the show when she comes on, but like, she is there is no equivalent character type to her in other Gundam shows. Like, is there anyone you could think of that would like fit that role? It feels like a very new figure for Gundam.
The closest would be Queen Diana in Turn A Gundam, but that's also pretty different. Like, but that's
because Queen Diana is also not a pop idol who sings songs that her entire nation loves. You know, it's like she is such a unique creation, and they honestly lean into it. She is drawn like an idol. Rie Tanaka has that kind of voice that is good for that. It's a really interesting character, and I agree. I think in the second half, all the stuff she does is like she becomes a clear highlight of the show. But she's a little like, boy, this feels like a new thing going on here, and it is. It's intentionally. She is like a non Gundam 79 character intruding on a like Gundam 79 situation, and that's what makes it so dynamic, you know?
Yeah. So on that, like, I think she's clearly inspired by characters from the Macross franchise, because Macross has that dynamic going back to the original one. I've only seen the original one all the way through and like little bits of some of the other OVAs they did. But like big dynamic of Macross is you have a love triangle at the heart of the show, and one of the parts of the love triangle is a pop sort of figure. I think the big thing they do to kind of like innovate on or evolve that character archetype that they borrow a little bit from Macross is it feels kind of like she's a combination of one of the pop idol character from Macross and like a Sayla from 0079. And they kind of like put those archetypes together where she has the strength of a Sayla type character while having like the sort of like appeal of the sort of pop singer Lin Mimei, who's the character from the original Macross. Yeah, like Lacus is one of like my favorite characters from the show. I think she's so interesting. She's so unique. It also just leads to some of my favorite interactions, where I think one of my favorite little tiny moments in this part of this show, kind of motivated by Lacus, is this is the section where they start kind of developing a little bit more the whole like Flay is racist against the coordinators, and all that kind of stuff. And there's an interaction at the end of one of these episodes when Lacus is on board, where Sai and Kita are talking outside of her room, and Sai is basically talking about like, hey man, like, I know like Flay is on her weird stuff, but like we trust you, we believe in you, like I'm your friend, I don't care that you're a coordinator. And they have that conversation, and then they hear Lacus start singing in her room, and then as Sai turns to walk away, he kind of like quietly sort of says, man, she's got such a beautiful voice. I wonder if that's also because they like engineered that when she was a baby, and walks away. And then the camera just hangs on Kita for a little bit as Anani Shodatanani starts playing. And it is such a great little moment of, as in this early section, like as it goes on, like one of the things it does with Kita is it like isolates him more and more as a character, where he's like fighting for his friends, and yet at the same time, as he's fighting and he becomes more powerful and all this stuff, very much like Amuro in the original Gundam, it is isolating him and distancing him from those relationships, and it's sort of Kira is constantly kind of slowly pushing himself into this corner. And I love that little tiny moment. I think is really well done with Sai. That shows that, like, even though they are really well-meaning, his friends still see the world through that lens and still fundamentally see Kira in that way. Like, they don't necessarily just see him as one of them. They see him as something separate or other or different. And I think that is a really great little moment.
Oh, I agree. I remember that one vividly because I think this is when the show, literally when they bring on the pop idol Locus, is when they start using insert songs and music like a lot more in the series. Either diegetically through Locus or elsewhere. And the show does always because of how they do the end credits, which is so fucking slick. That's one of my favorite things about the show from the beginning. But anyway, yeah, I remember that moment vividly. And I think, what you're describing there is like Psy and everyone else become like the well-meaning white people,
Yes.
Like the guys who are like, we love having you as our black friend, like that's kind of what it's like in like an American context. And Kira's like, I know you guys are good, well-meaning and like nice, but like that was kind of racist, and like that's kind of what happens. And it, you talked earlier about all the like GMO and cloning stuff playing into an early 2000s sense, but this is also just in media in the early 2000s is that like explorations of racism through like literal different species of humanity in fiction. Like the X-Men movies lean really hard into this, right? And they also do it not just as a racial thing, but as a gay straight dynamic. But like a lot of that early boom of 2000s superhero media does that. Honestly, I think Gundam SEED should be understood as part of like that kind of like worldwide superhero boom, because this show does have, you made the Superman comparison earlier, it has more like superheroic elements in it than I think Gundam has had before in some of its tropes and stuff. And that's definitely playing into it. But what you were saying about Kira being distanced from his friends, one of the things that's happening over the course of this side of it is Kira is honestly becoming less motivated to fight for the side he's on. Yeah. And that's one of the things that frustrated me. But when we talk about it again, I'm like, God, that's really fucking smart. That like as he goes, his core motivation is just, I want to fight for these people because they're my buddies. But as he feels less and less connected to his buddies, and we see more and more, good God, these Earth Federation people are bad. That's what was frustrating me, making me tear my hair out. But that's the point. That's the point. That's what's going to bring Kira to his breaking point of like, what the hell am I doing this for? There has to be something bigger to all of this, and we get there. And the show knows what it's doing, no doubt.
Yeah. So the last moment I want to zoom in on in this kind of like the first space section of the show is episodes 12 and 13. Which I think this is a really interesting thing to look at in comparison to the original Mobile Suit Gundam, is that it takes them basically twice as long to get to Earth, but they basically bring Kira to a similar point, or they do like a very similar like big character moment at the exact same episode count as it happens for Amuro, which is specifically these two episodes, basically the end of episode 12, then all of episode 13. Episode 12 being Flay's decision, and 13 Stars Falling into Space, which is the full Earth entry episode. That comes at the same point as episode 13 in the original Mobile Suit Gundam, which is Coming Home, where that episode is the episode where they fully establish now that Amuro has no out because he has made the explicit conscious choice to stay with the white base, right? And so it is this moment in the show where the character is offered an opportunity to leave, and then they deny it, right? And say like, no, I'm going to stay on. And that's what this moment is for Kira in between those two episodes. And I really like the way that it's very differently played, and the dynamic is very different. I think it tells a lot about the themes of Gundam SEED, that how different it is. Where for the original Mobile Suit Gundam, it's way more of like a personal kind of decision for Amuro, right? And how much he's grown, the things he's experienced, and he's, becoming an adult and kind of realizing that he can't go back to this sort of like childish place of nostalgia and return to his mother and all this stuff, that he has to move on. And like there's like really no home left for him that he has found, and like that home is an illusion, and he has to move on, and he makes the choice to stay with the white base. For Kira, he is given the choice, and like everybody is given this opportunity to finally leave on this shuttle, and they're all going to go. And then Flay, because her father has been killed, and now she's like, this is where she does her big like Kateshina turn from Victory Gundam, where she starts to kind of like become a little bit evil, where she makes this explicit choice to join the military and make a big show of joining the military in front of everybody, and then just thus kind of like guilting everyone to then follow suit. And so all of Kita's friends now make the choice, and they decide of their, more or less of their own free will, whether it's not really their free will or not, I guess is like up to debate. But they make this choice to stay with the army right when Kita and everyone is like getting to leave, and Kita is like lining up for the shuttle. And it's like one of like, especially when you see and you know where Gundam Seed goes, and Gundam Seed consciously understanding that the Earth Federation is like bad and joining them is bad. It's like a really dark moment to see like Kita's like lining up, and it's like, we're going to get out of here. And he's lining up on his own. And then you cut to all of them like deciding to join the military and realizing like this is the moment where Kita has to stay, right? It's like he has, like, now the choice has effectively been taken away from him, and he has no option but to kind of jump in head first now, because there's no escape, there's no out. His friends have decided to join the military. There's no potential future that he can fight towards that has them safely on Earth or on another colony or whatever, because now they're just a part of the fucking ship's crew. And so now Kita is stuck. And it is this really dark moment where I think one of the things that Gundam Seed is really interested in is like the sort of mechanisms of larger structures of power and how they dehumanize and manipulate individuals to the like system's own benefit. And that's what happens here, where the system has constructed these expectations that kind of push these children into joining the military. And then once that's happened, it like everything just kind of closes around Kita, and he has no ability to escape. And he's just stuck there. And I think it's interesting that kind of the choice he makes when he's stuck there is to try to be an Amuro and like kind of pretend like it's his choice, right? Like he's lining up and he's about to get on the ship, and then he hears that they're all of his friends are staying, and he looks at the ship and he looks back at the Archangel and looks at the ship and looks at the Archangel, and he like rips up his papers, his dischargement papers, and like decides to stay. And it is this like really, I think, tragic, powerful moment that is very interesting to me, where it is that coming home thing, but it's played so incredibly dark that Kita has been manipulated and closed in on and entrapped in such a way that he has to jump in like enthusiastically and participate in the military now, because he has no choice, because there's no way out for him anymore.
Yeah, and the other thing you're missing in that moment is the refugees who are getting on the ship, and the little girl gives him the little paper flower. And that becomes a big thing in episode 13, obviously. And that is the other thing. I think that is a really slickly produced sequence. It's really well done. It actually made me kind of sit up and take note, because like I said, I think there's a lot of kind of slack in the direction of this half of the show to me. But I think that scene is really well directed, where there's music over it, and Kira is like making that decision and goes. And something about it when I'm watching it felt very dissonant in a way where like this is a compelling sequence and I'm not sure what it is I'm feeling here, and it's exactly what you're describing, but I think first time through, you would not get how dark it is meant to be, right? Because it's played as heroic, but also like it is interrogating the nature of heroism that is being pushed by this choice.
Yeah, that is heroism for an evil system, basically. And it's like, I just find like that was one of those moments that really stood out to me on second viewing, that like, I don't know, like it didn't leave a massive impression. Like what left a huge impression to me the first time I watched it was the shuttle getting blown up in episode 13, which to me is like it's one of those things where like the literal logic of it would obviously work out such that if Kita and all of them had hopped on the shuttle, they would have died. But that's like not the narrative logic or like the emotional logic of that moment. I feel like the emotional logic of that moment of the shuttle blowing up is effectively it's a punishment for Kita, saying this like, but you can't protect everybody. Like what you're trying to do is something you can't do because of the choices you're making. And it's like, it feels like as soon as he decides not to be on that shuttle, like the emotional logic of the story must mean that that shuttle cannot survive, because Kita's mission to try to be this like a grand protector while he's still fighting for the Earth Federation cannot be a success. And so the thing he's trying to save crumbles to dust in his hands. And he doesn't understand why that's the case. And he continues not to fully get it until you get to that episode 20-ish point.
Yeah. I wanted to briefly mention episode 13, which is our re-entry into Earth episode. And this is one where I think there's good stuff in here, like the shuttle blowing up. The end of the episode is very good. It is one where I think is emblematic of the problems with like action and animation in this half of the show, because re-entry to Earth episodes are always a highlight. From the original Gundam kind of puts that marker in the ground, and then all of them do it really well, I think. This one, I just think the action is frankly incoherent. Like, when there's the ship with the other Earth guy we like, the other like captain, and it gets blown up here, and I wasn't sure what was going on, because the only reason you know he's on that ship is because like Ramius on the Archangel says, "Oh my god, that guy just died." But they don't do like the very simple thing of like a cut in to the ship that's about to get attacked to show him there, and then go back out to getting blown up. It's just a ship blows up, and there's like no clear indication of whose ship that was. There's a lot of like geography of combat stuff that I think it does very poorly there. I don't think the show is ever top-notch at its action geography and stuff in the way like a Victory Gundam is, but I do think it's like particularly of note here. There's just a lot of like kind of visual incoherence in the directing and editing, and I think it holds this one back from what is usually a like Gundam highlight.
Yeah, no, I agree that I think action is never this show's strong suit, and I think it is like its weakest in these early sections. I think this is something where, again, I think like the aesthetics of the show, like space just looks really awkward to me in this first stretch of episodes where the backgrounds are very fuzzy. This is where like you can see a lot of like the very digital feel to it, of like camera pans and stuff like that feel awkwardly smooth and a little bit too fast, because they're very digital rather than being like literal camera pans. And it's that thing of where I think Gundam SEED, especially in that early section, is in this awkward place where it is not good enough for the digital stuff to do digital trying to replicate the way that analog animation feels. So it's not there, which we can do that now, and there are lots of shows that do that now very well. It's also not good enough at the digital stuff to take advantage of the things that only digital animation can do, and thus like succeed in that other aesthetic area. It's stuck in this weird middle ground where it's like not really doing either with the digital animation particularly well. And I think that's part of what leads to some of like the incoherency of the action, where that is the main improvement of the HD remaster, where that's like most of what they reanimated was most of the mobile suit stuff. So the action stuff like gets a pretty big boost at the consequence of then every single time you cut to humans in the middle of the action, it looks fucking terrible, because it's a big blown up, like, you know, cropped out 16:9 frame from original Gundam SEED that is just like very fuzzy and awkward because it's not actually really HD. It's that kind of like push and pull, but it's definitely like if you watch the HD remaster, like a lot of that animation in the fights is way more coherent and more interesting because they've figured out how to do that stuff with digital animation way better at that point.
Yeah. So I also wanted to mention here, this is where we get our first recap episode, and that is, this is not in the HD version, so if that's the only one you've seen, you won't know what we're talking about. But episode 14 of the original run, Within Endless Time, which I just want to say because it's a great title, is our first recap episode. But what's notable is it's not just a recap episode, it's actually the first half of it is a giant exposition dump, because this one is narrated by Raul Lecruce, and what he's doing is he's like going over the history of the Coordinator Natural conflict. And this one frustrated me. If you followed my tweets, there's a bunch of stuff I didn't like about this one, and we'll get into some of the specifics. But part of it is, I do think I wish more of this world building were organically worked into the show early on, because in addition to some of my other problems, I just found the world building in the first half very fuzzy. And some of that, again, I think is an intentional fuzziness in terms of Kira as our POV character not really looking to understand the broader situation. But part of it also just the very simple fact of like, what did Zaft do that caused this to become a war and not a one-sided like terrorist attack is not said until this exposition dump. And there's just things like that that frustrated me, where I'm like, why is so much of this reserved for a sort of non-diegetic exposition dump in the middle of the show? And I do find some of that frustrating. I think the world building could be cleaner in this half of the show.
I agree, and I think it's something that like extends to the second half as well, where like the world building stuff gets more interesting, To me, Gundam Seed has the feel of a setting that has, like, they created a really interesting lore Bible, and didn't entirely understand how to integrate it naturally into the
Yeah.
show. Because the glimpses into the lore you get usually is really interesting. But part of it is like they don't really kind of fully tip their hand on some of that stuff, like the nature of Kita as this like ultimate coordinator and all that you get with Le Creuset. You don't get all of that until like the last 4 or 5 episodes of the show. And so there's not a lot of time to unpack that. And it definitely just feels like a kind of thing where I know there's like manga and novel adaptations of Gundam Seed, and I bet those have a lot of, I know they have a lot of interesting stuff, because if you go to like the Gundam wiki and you look up any random Gundam Seed character, it's going to have a lot of information in there that is like stuff that the show implies, but is like very hard to like actually know based on just watching the show. And then when you see it written out in text and like expanded, it's like, oh, they came up with a lot of really cool stuff for the coordinator and natural and like that whole setting and the history of the cosmic era, which is the name of the setting for the Gundam Seed franchise. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff there, and I think it is one of the weaknesses of the show that they never really, I think, crack quite how to integrate it into the rest of the dynamic of the storytelling.
Yeah, like, you know, the thing, because this episode, again, it's narrated for us what the history of the thing is, where for the first time we get a clear, like, we saw the results of the Bloody Valentine in the episode you were talking about before the Scar of Space, but we actually get the full exposition of it here, which is what happened is that it goes back to like the history of the coordinators. People started to resent them. There were a lot of murders of coordinators in some extremely graphic images. That is one of the funniest things, is that Seed is on the whole much more kid-friendly than other Gundams, except it has some of the most graphic violence of all Gundams so far. Like, it's got way more blood and stuff like that than other Gundam does, which I think is funny. But anyway, yeah, you get him explaining like, okay, so then this terrorist group, Blue Cosmos, they blew up with a nuke this space colony, this plant. And then what the coordinators did in response, and I actually think this is so interesting, and I wish there was more of it like talked about in the show, and that's why it frustrates me here, is they created this N-jammer technology and embedded it all in the Earth. And what it does is it stops nuclear bombs from being used. It also, although I don't think the recap episode specifies this, you learn this like way later, that it also like wiped out a bunch of technology on Earth and sent them into like a Stone Age kind of situation. And that's part of why Earth is so mad. And that is one that just desperately you needed to be seen more, I think, in the world building, because it explains so much more of why Earth is in the state it is.
Yeah, because it's very much just like they're just because it's like it's both how do we stop nuclear weapons from being used. It's also like some of their justification for how mobile suits operate and why they're useful, because it's like the replacement of the Minovsky particle concept from the Universal Century. But then also I think it comes back in a really interesting way with the freedom and justice, where they are powered by a nuclear reactor, and so that's why they're so much more powerful than the other mobile suits, which I think is a nice, like, very natural explanation for why these mobile suits are like so much better than everything else.
Yeah. But then there's also the reveal of Mr. George Glenn.
Yeah.
And the history of and this is probably our most significant disagreement, Sean.
I think this is fucking great. I love this.
Okay. I think this is the dumbest moment of writing in all of Gundam that we have seen so far. I don't necessarily object to the basic idea. I think the way it is like revealed to the audience, and I tweeted this out, this is the dialogue. It all began with one man, George Glenn. Not only did he obtain his doctorate from MIT at the age of 17, he was also an Olympic silver medalist and a star player in the National Football League, and he was an ace pilot with the Air Force, and he made numerous wonderful achievements in the field of space aviation engineering. People from around the world looked up to this multi-achiever with admiration and waited with anticipation for his next miracle. I'm sorry, that is laying it on a little too thick for me. I don't like the trope of like the boy genius 17-year-old doctorate anyway, because it's just not a thing. But like, also he's an Olympic medalist, and he's a football star, and he's in space, like he's a rocket scientist, and he's an astronaut, and it's like this sounds like a kid making up a story at bedtime.
But I mean, you don't. But the next thing that's said is that's because he is the first coordinator. He's the first person who's
I
genetically
know,
engineered
but
to be
that's
a
still.
perfect human.
I don't care how do you have time to be both a rocket scientist and a national football star?
Because
I
you're
don't care how
fucking
good you are at those
superhuman.
things. There
How
are
is
just
Superman able to go and be Superman? Like, because he's fucking Superman. It's like it's what George Glenn is, right?
But
it's
they don't
basically-
have Clark Kent does not like he's a journalist and he does Superman stuff. He doesn't also like get Olympic medals and play on the football team and do this and that. It's just kind of I just think it's bad writing. That's all.
It's just, to me, it is. I think part of it is he is. One of the reasons I like it is that he is like super generic American exceptionalist American man, right? So this is a Japanese show. So he's George Glenn, blonde hair, blue eyes, big fucking chin. And so of course he plays football. Of course he's an Olympic athlete dude, right? Like he is and I think I really like that they make him this like over the top ridiculous. Like the tweet I tweeted at you is that he's Captain America. Both in the sense that he's genetically modified, like superhuman. I guess Captain America is not technically genetically modified, but he's a superhuman character that also is like meant to embody this like American concept, right? And I think it is a little bit goofy for sure, and they lay it on very thick. But I think I like it. I think there's something about them setting up. It's like, here's this ridiculous list of achievements, and then you find out, well, the reason he was able to do this is because he was genetically modified, and that's like kind of like the point is, if you're a parent, and you're someone who's like your wife is pregnant or something, and then you turn on TV and you see this guy, the idol, the greatest human being who has ever lived since Jesus fucking Christ. And then you find out that the reason he's like that isn't because he worked very hard and he just like, pulled himself up by his bootstraps and all that shit. It's like, no, he was created by a system to be the perfect person. Well, then I've got a lot of money. I want my child to be the perfect human being also. Like, I think it makes a compelling argument for the like psychology of the people living in this world and of like the naturals of their like perspective on what coordinators are and like what it has done to people as a whole. I definitely agree they lay it on thick, but I think like the fundamental concept is really strong.
Okay, so I like what you're saying here about he's like it's like the personification of the dumb American names we get on Gundam, right? Mm-hmm. Of like extending that to the nth degree of just give him every American factor of. They should have also had him be a stockbroker. They really should have had him like he gamed the stock market and became a billionaire. That would be the only way to make it the full American experience. I do like that idea. And I also like what you said on Twitter, Sean, when you were talking to me about this, of like, it's like if Captain America put out the formula for making more Captain Americas, and that's how the world is created. I like that idea too. I do still think that like they could have done it in less of a dumb Saturday morning cartoon way, because I think Gundam, it is a Saturday morning cartoon in some ways, but I think it's smarter than that, and I think this show is smarter than that. But I will grant you, it is not the worst thing in the world. There is something. I think there is a seed of a good idea in there, and I like what you're saying about it.
Okay, good. It is also like I think important to note that is like mostly relatively inconsequential information. Like it's something that's like it's nice sort of like world building around the edges, but you get like more than enough of like the actual like because they dig into that how the coordinator stuff impacted the world and how it affected the like way that like people are born and like how they the like designer baby and all that kind of stuff. It gets into that, so it's like you don't actually need this information. So if you watch the HD remaster, you didn't get any of it because it's not necessary. It's just something they did to sort of throw into this recap episode to be like, let's make it slightly more interesting than just a recap episode.
Which is weird, because actually I don't know if I would want to cut this entirely if I were doing the recut of the show. Like, I get why they did, but there's, like, I would almost have, like, taken the relevant stuff in this and cut it maybe into episode, I think it's 27, which is about half a recap episode, with Erica Simmons going through and, like, she's theorizing about the SEED thing, and then the other half is Kira seeing the new mobile suits that Orb is making. And I would have, and then 26 you can cut entirely because that's just pure boring recap. But like I would have put some of this in there because it feels like it's necessary, just in the sense of giving you some of the like, even if you get a lot of this information elsewhere, seeing some of it in a chronological presentation helps. But yeah, We don't need to talk about it more than that. The next phase of the show is the Earth phase, right?
Yes.
Where we are moving across They're basically moving across... Where do they land? They land, like, in Florida or something, right?
No, they land in Africa.
Oh, they do? Okay,
yeah,
right.
they land in northern Africa.
Okay. Yeah, and then they've got to get over to Alaska. And that is a long stretch of the show. But yes. So yeah, this stretch, I think there's some good stuff in here. This one did feel like a lot of this is elongated to me. I like the stuff with Andrew Waltfeld more in theory than in practice because I think it's a little undercooked, but there is some good stuff there. But the big thing here is this is where we get Kagali as the new big character.
Yeah, this is definitely, to me, the weakest stretch of the show. I think it is. It goes on too long. I think it's like, I like some of the Andrew Waltfeld stuff, but I think they could have like gotten that and the Kagali stuff down into a much tighter chunk of episodes. Because this is where I feel like Kita, because after Kita has reached his point in episode 13 where he's now decided to join, you get some stuff, but you mostly just get fallout from that decision of like his relationship with Flay. And yeah, I agree that I think this is where, to me, Seed has the biggest pacing issues. But yeah, this is so. One thing here is just I'm thinking about some of the stuff that happens here. This is where you get one of like the weirder mobile suit designs in Seed, where you have what is basically just Metal Garurumon from Digimon, which is a big metal wolf that like rides around in the sand. And I like the concept of that's the reason why they're really good, is because the sand has this like uneven footing or whatever, and so when you have this four-footed mobile suit, it's more suited for that terrain, and I think that's kind of cool. But I think it like doesn't help any of the action stuff, because I think it's like they don't really figure out how to do good action necessarily with those mobile suits. I think they're like slightly too exotic, and I find like a lot of the fights with them are just like the exact same fight that you see like 4 or 5 times.
It's really repetitive. Othran is not in this stretch a ton, right? Because he's somewhere else on Earth.
No, yeah, he's back at the plant. So you cut to him occasionally and get some of the... Because this is where you get some of like the setting up, like Nicole, and you get some of like the set him up for his inevitable death by humanizing him and seeing this like, oh, he's like the good boy all he wants to do is stay home and play the piano.
I mean, he's almost exactly... What's the name of the character in Gundam Wing? The like blonde one of the pilots?
Quattro.
Yeah, he's basically Quattro, and it's like, it's so funny because it's like if that like the adorable boy from Gundam Wing got brutally murdered, that's basically Nicole, which is a good idea, I think.
Yeah, so it's like that's what you get in terms of Othran, because this is also where Dierka and Izak are like on Earth, and they've been like, stranded there, right? Yeah, but so because you kind of have the Zaft side is sort of like dispersed. You have Andrew. But like, I guess because it's like generally I think it's just like there's just a bunch of episodes they could have been condensed here. A couple of things I do like because I feel like this is around the time when Kita first starts using the seed factor thing, right? And you get all that stuff happening, and he's like more than just like, oh, he's a very good mobile suit pilot. It's like, oh, he's just like impossibly good. So you do get some good action beats here, even if the fights themselves aren't great. Where I like all the stuff of Kita, like in his first fight on Earth, where usually the first fight on Earth for any mobile suit, like the protagonist of a Gundam, the Gundam boy, when they fight in gravity for the first time, they just get completely fucked up. Or if it started on Earth and they fight in space for the first time, they get completely fucked up because that's like the dynamic, right? And here it starts out that way, and you're like, oh, here's the first time he fights in an unexpected scenario, and he's going to get his ass kicked, and then he's going to have to learn from the mistakes in the next episode, come back and be better. And it's like, no, Kita just like immediately reprograms the fucking Gundam on the fly to like accommodate for the different pressure of the sand and the fucking like the way that the heat coming off the sand diffracts his beam rifle, and so he changes like the dispersion ratio of the fucking beam and all this shit, and he just does that, and he just fucks them up completely, and he like pretty soundly wins that fight on Earth. I'm like, I think that is a pretty cool moment to sort of put Kita in a very different position than other protagonists. Again, as this Superman-esque character where his abilities are like second to none. He's like frighteningly capable as a mobile suit pilot. The problem is that he just has no idea what the fuck he's doing from an ideological perspective. And now he's like got his whole like relationship with Flay, so he's like a horny teenage boy on top of it. So it's like he's got his whole weird like manhood on the line as well. So it's like he's just going around murdering. Like, this is the most murderous Kira is in the whole franchises. He's just like gunning people down willy-nilly basically at this point.
Yeah, I like that moment too when he programs the Gundam on the fly. That's pretty cool. Or the strike on the fly, because we didn't talk about this yet, Sean.
It's true.
It's not technically called a Gundam. Gundam's not a thing in this world. This is the show that says the word Gundam the least. I think that's actually like been counted. Because let me look this up. I have the picture here. It's not a Gundam. It is a general unilateral neurolink dispersive automatic maneuver.
Yeah, well, that's not what the mobile suit is. That's one aspect of the OS.
Yes.
Yes. So yes, it's that thing where I'm just going to call them Gundams because.
Yes.
Because it's like the ironic thing is, yes, none of these are Gundams. There are also more Gundams in this show than any other Gundam. There's like 11 or 12 different unique Gundam type mobile suits that have like the whole Gundam aesthetic. So much so, Jonathan, that apparently when they're coming up with the title of the show, the original title was going to be Gundam Saga, and then they changed it to Gundam Seed. But they wanted to keep the S because apparently the part of the original concept was it wasn't just Gundam, it was Gundams, like aliens. And this is because we've got a bunch of them in this one.
That would have been great if this had just been called Mobile Suit Gundams.
Yeah, it would be a very hard title to Google, but it would have been very good.
Yes.
But yes, so yeah, that is one of those like early 2000s thing about this show that very much feels like, like the old X-Men movies and stuff, where you have to like explain stuff, like why he says Gundam. That's like not something you need to explain. It's fine. It's just a Gundam. It's just a weird, cool name. It's okay.
I mean, there's acronyms for everything. They have an acronym for Gundam. They have an acronym for Seed. They have ZAFT is an acronym. I mean, like everything's an acronym in this show. It's hilarious.
Yes, so they're really hot on their acronyms, but yes.
But anyway, yes, we're talking about the Gundams. One thing we should probably touch on in this phase of the show is Flay, and like that there is this sexual relationship where he's crying, and then is this after he kills Andrew, or is that earlier?
No, that's before that. Yeah,
okay.
This is like episode I think 15 or so is where this happens.
Yeah. Oh, because it's because of the hostage ship. It's when they first get to Earth, and there's the ship of refugees that was shot down by Izak, and that's actually a really powerful moment. And then so Kira, for the first time, and I made a tweet about this yesterday. This is something I really value about Gundam Seed, genuinely, is that there are multiple moments where Kira just breaks down and fucking cries, and not like a heroic, like single tear, this is sad. It's like uncontrollable, sniveling, ugly crying, in a way that I think would be very realistic of a boy in the middle of a war.
Yeah.
And I really like it. I like the space for that emotionality. I like that they allow Othran to do it too. And I like that that's actually the note the show ends on when we get there. And it's something that I think is really beautiful about this show and its presentation of masculinity, which I think does partially come from what you were talking about of its influences from shoujo manga. It does not. I don't think that would be in here if that was not part of it. But there is something that is really cool about that I like.
Yeah. I completely agree that it does. It has a way more sort of like tender perspective on like its male characters than you would normally get from this kind of show.
Yeah.
So it then leads to him and Flay's relationship, which is a huge part of the show. That I find pretty interesting. That Flay's character, I like that she starts out as this like very Katejina-san-esque character from Victory Gundam, where she's rich girl, who like thinks she's owed way more than she actually is, and slowly as she gets spurned and more kind of traumatized over the course of that early stretch of episodes, culminating in her father's death, she then like turns evil basically in that kind of like broad way where she starts becoming the manipulator, right? And so she manipulates people to stay on and join the military, and then she enters this relationship with Kira, even though she's was with Sai, as a way to manipulate Kira and keep him fighting, and that's part of where they're this is the first and one of the only, I think there's only one other instance I can think of off the top of my head in a Gundam TV show where it is like directly implied, or I mean, again, the movie special edition version and then footage from that was cut into the HD remaster version, there is just a straight up sex scene that's like very short and it's like, covered in shadow and stuff, but it is, these two characters have sex. And that's, I think, a really interesting thing for the show to tackle that no Gundam show up to this point has done directly, in the way that just like, I think they do a good job of showing how that just like really fucks everything up for Kida, because his whole emotions in his perspective in the scenario and his relationship with Flay gets completely fucked up because there's now this like weird sexual component to it that beforehand he had this weird kind of one-sided crush on her. And then as soon as that's fulfilled, he doesn't really know what to do with it, because it's clear he's not getting any like emotional benefit from this relationship with her, because they're both like hurting each other because they don't actually have that kind of relationship. But they like can't help but be close to each other. And that dynamic over the course of this episode and what it does to Kida, where you have that like really great scene where Sai fully confronts them and then the information comes out, and then Kida just Sai tries to shove Kida, and Kida just grabs his arm and like puts him to this like arm hold behind Sai's back, and just says like, "Stop it, man, like I'm just tired, can't you see you're just bothering everybody," and just shoves him away. And it's like a very not Kida type move where he's trying to be all alpha male. I think all that stuff, when they just get into the goopy teenage drama of it, that's where this section of the show I think is its strongest.
I agree, and honestly, it was kind of shocking when you get to that moment where he wakes up in the morning and like is putting his clothes on. I'm like, I rewound it. I was like, did that actually just happen? Because that's something that in like the different novelizations you would get, starting with the original Tomino novelization of Gundam where he sleeps with Sayla. And it's actually a very similar circumstance in that novel when Amuro and Sayla first do it. But like in this, it's just on a show, especially because this is in a lot of ways, from its like color design and palette to some of its like writing, is a little more kid friendly. It's kind of shocking that they did that and they went there, and I think it's good. I think it's something that makes this stretch really interesting. And I haven't even seen the HD version, where apparently it's, as you just said, it's a little more explicit. When you said that, like, there's a full sex scene, I'm like imagining like it's like, what, they went like full hentai for like a scene? It's like, no, but
yeah, it's one of those things where it's like it's one of those things that's like weird to talk about this stuff, because I say sex scene and I feel like that puts in people's heads like, oh my god, they're just fucking it, and they're just fucking doing it. It's like, I mean, no, it is like a movie where it's just like they're in shadow and there's like a moan and it like does some like crossfades and stuff.
Yes.
It's like it's very sort of suggestive, but it's not, you're not getting like full frontal hardcore Gundam action. If that's what you're looking for, just Google that and turn safe search off.
So what else do we want to talk about with this section? Andrew Waltfeld, I think I really love his intro scene. Well, you get him in a couple moments, but when he meets Kira and you have the scene where Kagali and they are having like their sort of Middle Eastern food, and she's trying to get him to put the chili sauce on, and he wants him, and Andrew comes over and is like, no, you need to use this yogurt sauce, and they have this fight over it. That is one of my favorite scenes in Gundam Seed. It is so lively, it is so fun, it is so different than any scene I think I've seen in Gundam before, where it is just kind of goofy hangout slice of life thing while it is also establishing Andrew's character. I really like that scene.
Yeah, and I like how like at odds Kida is with it. Like he's just so like he does not fit into this weird like sort of like normal human bickering you get between Kagali and Andrew.
Yeah.
I do like in that whole sequence also you cut back to the Archangel and everyone on the Archangel and how like just stressed the fuck out they are because Kida's not on the ship, because it's like the first time he's not been on the ship for the whole show. And they're like, and it is one of those, again, it's that like very different relationship than with Amuro, where it's just like, man, like if he's not here, like they're just like feel totally helpless. I think that dynamic, like this like toxic codependency thing that they have, is really good and how they portray it there. But yeah, you have his relationship with Andrew, who is, broadly our Ramba Ral, although you do have our actual Ramba Ral, who is that one dude who's like leading the guerrilla forces or whatever in the desert. So we have our Ramba Ral voice actor cameo. He's been in like almost every show at this point, other than some of the earlier like Zeta and Double Zeta. I don't think he pops up there. But so you have Andrew, and I do think it's interesting what they kind of use Andrew for ultimately is fairly different than Ramba Ral, because they go to this point where he brings them into his mansion, he points the gun at them, and that's where he has that whole speech about, like, what does it mean? Like, how does this war end? How do you end a war? Does the war end when we kill every single enemy? What does it mean for someone to be an enemy? You are my enemy. And like, he's kind of goes through that. And that's a very important moment, because that is one of the moments that becomes one of like the main sort of fuels for the flashbacks in the later section that we'll talk about, how Gundam Seed uses flashbacks, I think, when they get a little bit heavier in the orb section. But it is that moment where he plants this seed. God damn it, I cannot avoid using that fucking phrase. He plants the seed in Kira's head of this idea of, oh, right, like, how does the war actually end? What does it mean for someone to be my enemy? Like, and that's a really important idea that Kira has to muddle over, because for Kira, like, the way that Kira views the world, he has no enemies, right? He's this like naive little boy that even when he's out murdering people, he's not thinking of it in that context, because he doesn't see Andrew, I think, as his enemy at any point. So when he's fighting Andrew later, when Andrew's piloting the yellow Metal Garurumon, with his wife Aisha, who is voiced by one of the singers that I think sings the second opening theme, which is why her performance is fucking terrible. And it's like you usually don't hear just a really bad voice performance from like a big budget Japanese anime, but that's one, and that's how you get it, is if you hire a singer and not an actual voice actor to play the role, because it's like, man, her performance is bad. But when he kills her and you think that Andrew Waltfeld is dead, Kira's reaction is not like, I am alpha male, man, and I have done it, and I have like overcome this like sort of, Oedipal father figure thing that is kind of Amuro's relationship with Ramba Ral more. It's very much, he just breaks down into tears immediately. He's like, I just didn't want to kill you. Like, I did, this is not something I wanted to do. Like, I didn't want to fight you. I didn't want to kill you. And we have been pushed to this point where I had no choice but to kill you with my sick fucking Gundam knife, because the Gundam Strike has sick fucking Gundam knives. But yeah, I think that's like, it's an interesting way that they deliver to that very different moment where Kira does not learn the lessons of the Ramba Ral section the way that Amuro learns the lessons that he learns.
Yeah, I do think the Andrew section is undercooked. I think even for the different dynamic they're going for here, he is underdeveloped as a character relative to the importance of the scene. And I have to admit, I also think I like having Andrew around in the second half of the show later on when they bring him back. I also think it cheapens it a little bit. Just in the sense of, like, one, Andrew comes back and he and Kira never have an interaction. Just never. They never talk. There's never, like, there's like a brief, they see each other, but there's never, like, the, sorry about that whole killing your wife thing. Like, that doesn't come up. So I think that's a little bothersome. But yeah, I think the moment when it happens is good, because, yes, sick fucking knife, and I think the way that episode ends with Kira, like, screaming to the heavens, I didn't want to kill him, is very good.
Yeah. But I do want to emphasize, because I realized we didn't talk about it when we talked about the first two episodes, because I do love in that the first time that Kira fights someone, the only thing he has are these two knives that pop out the side of the Gundam, and it's like, that is so fucking cool. And I love whenever the Strike Gundam has to pull out its fucking knives.
I like that too. I'm not a huge fan of like the Gundam designs, especially in the first half of this show, but I do like that weapon element. And I also have to give a shout out to Metal Garurumon, who is maybe my favorite mobile suit in this show, other than I think the Justice Othran's second suit is phenomenal. But I really like Metal Garurumon because it has a double-sided lightsaber in its mouth, and that is very cool.
Yeah. Thinking about it, like, before we continue on with the story, I guess, like, maybe we should talk about some of like that kind of other production-y stuff that we haven't really dived into yet, because it's also making me think of so with the Strike Gundam, it's very clearly designed off of to look very, very similar to the original Gundam. Like, it's just basically the original Gundam with like a backpack that transforms into different modes, but which I think is not particularly interesting, but I think it works for when you get the Freedom Gundam, which is actually like Kira's proper mobile suit.
Right.
But one thing, there are two things I like about the Strike Gundam. One is that it's got these knives that I think, like, the armor Schneiders, I think is what they call them. And then two, the Sword Strike Gundam has the coolest beam sword, I think, in like fiction ever. I love the way it's big fucking sword that's basically like if you imagine a hacksaw, like a really long, thin hacksaw that you stick onto like a sword handle, and you replace the blade of the hacksaw with a beam that runs between the 2 points. That's basically the design of that big sword. And I wish that every beam sword in Gundam Seed was designed that way, because it makes so much more sense from like a physics and logic perspective than the lightsaber thing, where the lightsaber should just continue off into like infinite space because it's a beam of light, right? So there's no reason for it to be contained in this like one little like area. But the beam sword hacksaw thingy that this Gundam Strike has in its sword mode, like it makes sense that you would have this like thin oval that you have this really high powered laser running through that oval at high speeds to create the blade. I think that's a really sick design. That when he uses that in action scenes, even if the action scene itself is like kind of whatever, I always get very excited because I think that sword looks very, very cool.
It does. It's very good, and of course, it plays into one of the major moments in the series with Nicole. Oh, yeah. It's very good. Yeah, I agree.
You definitely get to see that sword cut very good. And then since this is also the halfway point of the show, we should probably talk about one of the greatest Gundam songs of all fucking time.
Yep.
Annani Isho Datanoni by Seesaw, which is the first ending theme for the first half of Gundam. And then it's so good, and they realize it's so good that, like, I'm sure they were, like, at some point almost, like, contractually obligated by Sunrise to have a different ending theme so they could sell more CDs and all that kind of stuff. And I do think the second ending theme, River, is quite good, and I really don't like that they replaced it with a more generic feeling song in the HD remaster. But Annani Isho Datanoni is so good that they just pull it in as a straight insert song several times in the second half of the show, because they're like, fuck it, dude, this song's so good, it's clearly like captures the exact mood and tone of Gundam Seed so perfectly, you can't help but use it. And then they have like 3 or 4 different instrumental versions of it that they also incorporate at some point.
It becomes part of the show's musical body. Like, it is a part of the score. It is a constant motif. It is the most recognizable motif of the second half of the show.
Yeah.
Like, I firmly believe if this was not an industry that required you to sell a bunch of CD singles, it would be the ending theme for all 50 episodes. There's no fucking doubt, right?
Yeah, it's so good. And then Gundam Seed does a thing that is one of my favorite things for anime to ever do, which is to start playing the opening section of the ending theme a little bit before it cuts to the actual credits, so that as the ending of the episode is playing, you get some big moment. And it's like the first time you get it is fucking great, because that's the one where you get it and it's playing as the fucking Archangel is like flying through the wall of the colony or whatever. And Kira and everyone like are turning to look at it in their mobile suits. And that's where you start getting like the opening bars of Annani Isho Datanoni, and then as it goes into like the main sort of like upbeat part of the song, and then cuts to the actual end credits sequence. So fucking good every time you get that. And then even with River, which isn't as good of a song, but when you start getting those first like acoustic guitar chords that start playing some emotional moment at the end of an episode, it fucking is so good every single time they do it.
Oh, I love it. I love it so much. And I love it with the third song, too, which I think is really good. I really like that final song as well, and I think it's used really well. And it's, the whole show, that is the slickest part of the entire production, is how every episode ends with the song coming in and then going into credits, and especially on Ana no Isha Datanoni, if I'm saying it right, which is just, although we were always together in English, is phenomenal. That song slaps to the moon and back. The guitar part in that song is killer. Yep. It is one of the best Gundam songs, undoubtedly, and it is Gundam Seed to me. Like, it is the Gundam Seed song. I don't know if there's any Gundam show I associate with one song that much. Maybe Turn A Gundam and the fucking song that plays over the final montage of that show, but like, it is this show, right? Like, it is so tied to what makes it good.
Yeah, and so this is where I want to talk about a musical artist in Japan that I like a lot because she's working a lot of my stuff, Yuki Kajiuda, who she is not the composer for Gundam Seed, but she's the person who basically was in charge of a lot of the insert songs in Annani Isho Datanoni. So she is the sort of composer for the band Seesaw, who has the vocalist Chiaki Ishikawa, and Seesaw did that song, and they did a couple of the other songs, I think. And it's kind of like weird because Yuki Kajiura did stuff for like multiple different bands, so sometimes it's kind of confusing for like which group did this song, because it's like sometimes it's just credited to Kajiura. But then also like Akatsuki no Kurama or The Wheels of Dawn, that song, which is the other best song in Gundam Seed, that is also, she composed that song. All of the Lacus Klein songs are composed by Kajiura, who that are also, those are like form different backbones, I feel like, of the soundtrack, which is very leitmotif heavy. So all of these like insert songs and stuff get turned into leitmotifs effectively that get played throughout the show. And so Kajiura, even though she wasn't the main composer, like her musical contributions to the soundtrack and the overall like sonic space of Gundam Seed is like incalculable. And she's just worked on a bunch of stuff I really, really adore. If people like the Fate Stay Night franchise, she's done a lot of music for that. So she did the score for Fate Zero. She also did all the, and maybe my favorite work that she's done in terms of soundtrack is the soundtracks for the Garden of Sinners movies, which are kind of spin-offs of the Fate Stay Night franchise. And those movies have really, really killer soundtracks that are Kajiura and another band that she composes for called Calafina. And Calafina is just like legitimately one of my favorite Japanese bands. I listen to a lot of their music, whether it was used in anime or not, because it's basically just very ethereal music with like a 3-part lead female vocal harmony that kind of drives it, and it's so good. And all of her music is just absolutely outstanding. She also did all the music for the Madoka Magica franchise as well, which has great music. So like that is just like a shout out to Kajiura and her work, because it is like so fucking good. And this is where like the first stuff I heard from her, and then when I looked her up, I'm like, oh wait, she's done like the soundtracks to like half of my favorite shows that have aired since like 2005, basically.
Yeah, and I agree. Like when you lay out all the stuff she did for the show, she's probably a more important musical voice than anyone, because those are all the themes that I think impact the show most. Yeah. So yeah, but no, phenomenal song. Love how they do this. It's the best way into credits since After War Gundam X, which is the other one that does a really creative thing with it. So I like that a lot. But this next phase of the show, Sean, the 20s basically, is I think where the show really starts to turn, for obvious reasons. There's an episode called The Turning Point. That's episode 29. But you get this basically Othran kind of back into the action. You get the characters going to the Orb Nation and all the stuff that happens here, including that episode that I mentioned earlier that was like the first one that really made me sit up and take notice, which is episode 24, War for Two, which is Kagali and Othran stranded on this island. And I really love that one. I think it helps snap Kagali's character into focus, because I think she's been a little lost in the background in the last couple of episodes. And I think Othran really moving him into that deuteragonist role that we might, if we want to go with literary theory, of the secondary protagonist. I think this is the episode that really firmly puts him there, and it's a really good half hour.
Yeah, no, it is definitely, it is like one of the best episodes in the show. That, like you said, it kind of like recenters everything. It has that great moment where, because the whole dynamic, of course, is Kagali and Othran both get stranded on this island, and they're on opposing sides, so they start fighting each other. Othran overpowers her because he's a coordinator, and he's also like a trained military, like he's basically a commando. And so he overpowers her, and then they're having that conversation over like the campfire at night while they're drying their clothes. And Kagali just starts to kind of emotionally kind of break down a little bit, because she's so struggling with this. She doesn't want to kill people, but she looks at Othran's Gundam, the Aegis Gundam, and she just starts screaming. It's like, but how, like, that thing is going to kill people on Earth, right? Like, you've brought that thing to kill people. How many people are you going to kill here? And she just like screams at him. And it's clearly like, is one of those moments that like really gets through to Othran, who he's like, very much like Kira, he is fighting in the military, and he has way more of a reason than Kira does, because he's got the whole thing where his mother died in the Bloody Valentine incident. So, you know, I mean, he's very much, Othran and his friends are very much the like young, like U.S. military like soldiers who joined up immediately after 9/11 to like go teach those bastards what for, right? Like that's kind of the dynamic there. And it's the first time that he's like actually thinking about like, oh, right, yeah, like I'm here and like I'm going to kill people, and not all the people that are going to die are his enemies, quote unquote. They're not all just going to be mobile suit pilots. Like the fallout from the destruction of these huge encounters is going to kill lots of people that are utterly unrelated to it. And I think that's that moment, which is another like moment that stands out because it's a moment they flash back to a lot. Is a really powerful interaction between those two in that episode.
Absolutely. The next sort of batch of episodes, not a ton happens because you get the episode where they get to Orb, and then you have a recap episode, and then you have a partial recap episode. But then you get some of the stuff in the Orb Union, which I think is interesting. We've one thing I think is a little weird is that Orb is technically the home country of most of our main characters, and I don't feel like that is focused on very much in this stretch of like this is like where they're nominally from. They didn't live there before, but like Heliopolis was a colony of Orb, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it feels a little weirdly detached from that. But, you have all the scenes where the characters go meet their parents. Kira refuses to meet his parents, which is a little thing that I don't think ever really gets resolved in the show. We learn more about Kira's parentage, but, like, the entire, like, some of the stuff with them. But I do like it here, because he's basically feeling guilty and all this other stuff. But the end of episode 28, which is the episode just called Kira...
Yes.
This is the episode that was the turning point for me. It's actually not episode 29, which is called The Turning Point. It's the end of episode 28, and there is this beautiful, haunting scene where Kira's bird, his birdie, his tori, which he has his little toy bird through the whole show that Othran made him, it flies away and he goes and chases it. And Othran and his buddies have broken into Orb to cause some mischief. And they are on the other side of a fence, and Kira is on this side of the fence, and the bird flies over to the fence, and Othran and Kira recognize each other. They sort of pretend not to, because it would be so messy, and Kira has this whole thing about, like, this dear friend made it for me, and he's still my friend. And I think they just play, although we were always together over that scene, right? Even though that's not the end theme anymore, they play it. One of the best scenes in the show, and that was the one where I felt like, okay, I'm on board. Where are they going with this? And then I was immediately rewarded with episodes 29 and 30, which are tremendous.
Yeah, because this whole section that we're talking about where they're in Orb is basically, it's the calm before the storm, right? So that moment where Rikita and Othran see each other from across that fence it's the last time they see each other before all the fucking shit goes down. And there's just such a sense of it's ominous, right? There's this sense of things are on the horizon, that obviously it's like they are friends, they care about each other, but it's clear that like this situation is not going to get resolved. And I feel like there's just all those complex emotions wrapped up in this one small interaction. That I agree, that is one of my favorite scenes in the whole show.
It's sad, it's dark, it's evocative, it's the calm before the storm, but there is this just deep and abiding sadness within it that I think, more than a lot of like the sound and fury in other episodes, really translates that gap between them in a really beautiful way.
Yeah, and like just the very simple visual metaphor of the fence between them. It's just like, it's a really well directed, well put together scene.
Yeah. And then we get the turning point. And the turning point is that Kira murders Nicole, Othran's buddy, and then Othran murders Kira's buddy, Toru. And they're really sad and mad, and then Othran blows up a nuclear bomb in his chest, or I guess it's not a nuclear bomb yet, but he blows up his mobile suit, seemingly kills Kira, and the entire ground beneath the show shifts very harshly.
Yeah, it is an intense, like, it's one of like the most intense 2 episodes, because that's split between 2 episodes. So Nicole gets killed in episode 29, The Turning Point. Then episode 30, Flashing Blades, is where Othran and Dirka and Izak all go after Kira with a vengeance, and that's where Toru dies, and then Kira and Othran like fully try to just like straight up kill each other. It is just like an incredibly powerful moment of the show where, as I've sort of said multiple times now, like that first section, like the first half leading up to this point of the show, is this pressure cooker of putting the main characters under intense pressure and like pulling out all their like escape routes, right? And so that's what you see as Kida starts losing his friends. He loses this like ability to kind of escape the scenario he's in. He's like, and he really has pushed almost everybody away at this point because he's had this weird relationship with Flay, which has like isolated him from all of his other friends because, I mean, you know, he's basically slept with his best friend's girlfriend, right? Like it is a pretty like social suicide kind of move he's done. And he's incredibly isolated. And even his relationship with Flay at this point is kind of like disintegrating. And then the other friendship he's had with Kaguli is going to stay behind in Orb. So it's like he's kind of has nothing left. He's so isolated that is like kind of like broken him down to this core. And then Othran as well is like being pushed to this point by Rao and his father and everything. That's like he really needs to just destroy the strike, and the only way to destroy the strike is kill Kida. So they've both been pushed to this breaking point. And I really love, there's a moment, I don't remember if it's before Kida kills Nicol or if it's after, but there's a moment where Kida is in the hangar looking at his Gundam and has a flashback to thinking about Andrew telling him about the enemy thing. And it's like, will this war end when we've killed every single enemy? You are my enemy. And then Kida says to himself, basically like, Othran, I'm your enemy. And it's like the first time, it feels like that little moment to me is where Kida finally loses this kind of like ideological battle he's had in himself the whole time, where he finally sort of understands himself within the context of the war and sees himself as Othran's enemy. And he like finally realizes like, this is what it is. Like, I am your enemy, even though he doesn't want to be, he has to be because of the side he's on. Yeah. And then that leads to him murdering the shit out of Nicol. And then Toru getting his fucking head blown off by a fucking giant Gundam shield. And this is where you're reminded that SEED is violent as fuck. Holy shit.
You're not just, it's not that you're reminded, it's that the show takes a certain mask off. Like,
yeah.
It's when you get to, I think what makes that turning point literally so powerful is that up to this point, I think you're lulled a little bit into this seeming like a more kid-friendly Gundam, which it continues to be in some ways, but like I think you think this is going to be more in the Gundam Wing vein of no major character deaths, and like it's just going to be gentler and like more bloodless. And it's not just not bloodless, it is brutal in like Tomino fashion. Like this is something the show fully integrates from Tomino Gundam, is how death is depicted. And it is not like quite to the level of a Victory Gundam in terms of the raw body count, but in terms of how those deaths land, it is really brutal. And there is no, like, when they kill Nicol and Nicol comes at him, and Kira comes under and just cuts that thing in fucking half, and you see the blade, the laser hacksaw, as you call it, Sean, go in and, like, seemingly cut Nicol at the abdomen. Yeah. Just brutally. And then the Gundam, Nicol's machine is like, there's sparks coming out of it, and it's getting ready to explode, and he says, Othran, run! And then he blows up. I just remember my jaw dropping and being like, I didn't know that was this show.
Yeah, and it's even a little bit more brutal than that, because he says Othran, and then his helmet pools with blood, and the helmet like shield cracks, and then it cuts and he explodes. Yeah. This is just like one of the most like really kind of like graphic images you get in a Gundam, which Gundam SEED like continues to be. It's had some like violent imagery previously, but from this point on, it is like incredibly bloody.
Yes.
And yeah, so you get that. Yeah, and it is just that, like, because it's a trend with like Gundam SEED in general, is it's brought back something that I feel like a lot of the non-Tomino Gundams miss, which is reminding you that even if it's just a grunt pilot that gets blown up, that's still a person that's been killed. So Gundam SEED regularly does the cut into cockpit, show the person like, you know, gasp or something before they explode, or like see them be injured. It doesn't just sort of allow you to like look at these sort of like faceless mobile suits and distance yourself from the human cost of what's happening. But then it is when it's a main character, it gets particularly brutal. So that's what happens to Nicol. And then with Toru, you have Othran just straight up throws his Gundam shield into the jet plane that Toru's piloting, and Toru's head gets chopped off and the whole thing explodes.
I mean, you see the shield go in and just this explosion of blood and the helmet is flying, and I think you're meant to kind of read like that's his head coming off.
Yeah,
and
well, there's definitely a very big spurt of blood coming from where his neck would be, so I think it's pretty heavily applied. That is not just a helmet. That is in proper Victory Gundam fashion. That is not just a helmet.
Yes. Oh my god. Yeah, no, I mean it's wild watching these 2 episodes and being like, okay, that's what this show is. And as you say, it gets very good about the Tomino thing of like everyone who dies is humanized, even if it's in a little like 1 second way. It's a very big part of the show. And I think in terms of finding a way to get into this second half of the show, which is about de-escalating the war and fighting for something different, starting with an event this extreme of Kira and Athran both becoming killers in a visceral, immediate way that they both see in themselves and each other, shows that they mean business. It's a buy-in to like this second half of like, they are not paying lip service to these ideas, they're actually going to go after these ideas. And I think that is, as a statement of intent, that's what makes this so compelling.
Yeah, and one other thing it does is it takes Kira off the board. Like, obviously he doesn't kill him. You're like left with this. It's the whole next episode. Kira is absent until the very end, where you see that he has survived somehow and then been taken by that Reverend, played by Jean from Ghost of Tsushima, and taken up to
Kazuya
Lacus.
Nakai.
Yeah, taken to Lacus in the space colony. But Kira is, even though he survived, he is off the board until basically the end of episode 35, where he gets his freedom, or it's the end of episode 34 is where he gets the Freedom Gundam, and 35 is when he actually re-enters the scene. So that's like, there's a solid, like, basically 5 episodes where he's more or less out of action, and that's, you use that to like kind of focus on the Archangel and what the Archangel is doing, and also you get a lot more Athran stuff in there as he's dealing with the fallout of what he's done. But like it takes it seriously. Like, it's not just a Kira, like, it happens and then the next episode Kira's fine and then he's back at it and he's like decided, no, I need to fight for something better than just this dumb war. They really let that like hang over the show for like a really tangible count of episodes.
They let it hang and they let the show transform in very organic fashion, because it really moves from being... Kira continues to be the #1 on the call sheet protagonist, but it's much more of an ensemble in the second half, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
It's an ensemble between him and Athran, but also with Kagali and Lacus, and the rest of the characters on the Archangel all become, I feel like, they come into focus a little more of what their role is going to be. And it really lets that unfold. It also, I think, in this stretch, because this next big kind of arc that happens after this is the attack on Orb, right? Or Alaska, sorry, yeah. Yeah, they get to Alaska, and then you have all the stuff that happens here. The Orb thing is later. But it creates, like, an immediate sense of, like, danger and like, a plot relevance that I think the first half, for good reasons and sometimes bad ones, I think is lacking in direction all the time. Like, sometimes it feels like a little aimless. And from here on out, like, there is a firm purpose to every episode and every piece of action, and it is fast, balls to the wall, like almost like OG Gundam pacing of like things happen at a really rapid clip. And so by the time Kira comes back, it's not just that he's out of commission for 5 episodes. A lot has happened by the time he gets back. Like Operation Spit Break, which is the greatest name for an operation in Gundam military history. It's the only Gundam military maneuver that sounds like a fucking sex act, is like well underway, and a bunch of people have like kind of shown their true colors, and the Earth fleet seems really fucking awful at this point, and yeah, there's just a lot going on.
Yeah. One of the moments in that Kira Athran fight from episode 30 that I really like is when Athran uses the seed mode for the first time, because Kira has used it like probably half a dozen times at this point, where he's gone sort of like, you know, Super Saiyan more or less, and he's just unstoppable. And that moment where Athran he screams basically like, I'm going to kill you. He says like, Omayo Uts, and then it zooms into his head and does like the whole seed sound effect while like the music's blaring and like fucking lightning is shooting off, and it's like just like cataclysm on Earth basically in this fight. It's like, they've really built it up to this like dramatically epic proportions, and that moment where you realize, oh, it's like Othrin as well. That Kira can't use the seed thing, his Super Saiyan mode, to like get out of jail free card. That it's like not as easy as that, right? That it's not just he's the good guy, so he gets the seed thing. So when Othrin uses it as well, and they fight to a stalemate, I think that's like a really good, powerful moment that is really well constructed.
Absolutely. I also think that's the turning point. I feel like it's a pun. Same with like using the word seed, because there's an episode called The Turning Point. But I also think that's where the action in the show gets better, is you can like trace it to that fight, where like almost out of narrative necessity, because if in these 2 episodes, 29 and 30, if the action choreography doesn't work, the story falls apart. I think they rise to the challenge, and I think that's where the show's action choreography goes from kind of bad to often quite good, if never great, in like the Tomino fashion. But I do think the fight choreography there is quite good.
Yes, it definitely gets a lot better.
Speaking of seed mode, I never gave the acronym for seed, which is
Okay.
even better than the acronym for Gundam. It's Superior Evolutionary Element Destined Factor. So it's really Seed F, but it's the Superior Evolutionary Element Destined Factor. I think we should call it Mobile Suit Gundam Superior Evolutionary Element Destined Factor. That's the name of this show. And the name of its sequel, Sean, is Mobile Suit Gundam Superior Evolutionary Element Destined Factor Destiny.
Yeah. The fucking acronyms, my god.
I love them.
And I do legitimately like that, dumb acronyms aside, they never really explain the seed thing, at least in this show. Like, they just, like, it's sort of like, I mean, it's sort of vaguely religious when the Reverend guy comes in. He's the one who, like, talks about it more than any other character. I kind of like that they just sort of leave it vague, kind of like the way that new types are in the original Gundam, where it's just like, you have a general idea sort of what it's talking about. It's like, okay, it's like, they're like, the seeds that for like a new future or something, whatever. Like they're more, I mean, it's in that acronym. They're like more highly evolved humans. So it's more or less the same new type concept. But I'm glad that they don't try to sort of science it up too much and just make it dumber that way. Just leave it vague, and I'll just buy that they can go Super Saiyan because they're the main characters.
So this next batch of episodes, like we were talking about, Sean, is where we have all the stuff in Alaska, where the Earth Federation, I guess they're called the Earth Forces, but whatever. The Earth people are revealed to be some real bastards.
Oh, yeah.
As the grieving crew of the Archangel is just sort of left stranded for a while, and then is sent out to die in the attack. And I also love the like military maneuvering here between Zaft and Earth, where Zaft's plan for Operation Spitbreak is they sort of telegraph that they are going to attack Panama, but what they're really going to do is attack Alaska, and their plan is that Earth will move all their forces to Panama, and then they will attack Alaska unimpeded. They seemingly succeed in this until it is revealed that the Earth people knew about this, and that they played along with it because they have a bunch of bombs under Alaska, and they just are going to blow everything up, including the Archangel, which is left behind essentially as a decoy. This is just a great piece of like almost like chess playing maneuvering, and then there is this like ticking clock within it for Kira, who is off the field, almost like in a Goku-esque fashion in Dragon Ball, where like he's fucking in the afterlife, and he's got to run along Snake Way until he gets back in the fight just in time to stop Nappa. It's like the same kind of thing here with him in the Freedom, and he does get back just in time to like make an impact. But we will talk about that moment because, as you say, Sean, it's really good. But yeah, that's what's going on here, and I think it's a super strong set of episodes.
Yeah, it definitely the intrigue and the maneuvering of the different factions here is really strong. But this is also where I feel we should probably stop and kind of hit some of the side characters since they become more important here, because we haven't really talked much about the different crew members of the Archangel itself. So you've got like Ramius, who is our Bright Noah, basically. She's our captain, voiced by Kotono Mitsuishi, Sailor Moon herself, who is now becoming a regular on Weekly Suit Gundam because she's in Afterward Gundam X, because she plays, I think Tanya is maybe the character's name, the blonde woman in Afterward Gundam X who's on the ship. She is, of course, I'm forgetting the character's name, but from Eva, the lady who with the red jacket with the purple hair that owns the apartment that is like,
Beer lady.
Yeah, beer lady
Beer
has the weird
beer
voice
boobs
she
lady,
does.
I think is what you actually call her, because that's what they focus on in Eva.
Yes. Who in Eva is also, she does the like next on previews, and that's where she does her like the fan service thing. And here Ramius also does the next on previews because Kotono Mitsuishi is like fucking amazing and she's such a good voice actress. But here they're much more in the like traditional Gundam, like we're not really saying anything of substance about in the next on preview. It's just sort of like vague ramblings about like the nature of war and like fate and like friends destined to kill each other, and it's just very good, and she's very good. And this will not be the last time we talk about her, obviously, because we'll talk about her on the next episode because it's Seed Destiny. But even that will not be the last time we talk about her because she's in at least one other Gundam show I can think of off the top of my head. There might even be another because she's very good and she's in a lot of stuff. But yeah, how do you feel about our captain, Murray Ramius?
Mixed, because I think in the first half of the show she doesn't make much of an impression. I think she is more interesting in the second half. She's never my favorite character in the show. And I think there's some points where I wish there was just a little more focus on her to fully flesh her out, but I do like the character quite a bit, by the end especially.
Yeah, I like her quite a lot. I don't know how much of that is like the character and how much of that is I just like the voice actor so much.
I do really love, there is every battle sequence, because this show actually focuses on ship-to-ship combat quite a bit more than any other Gundam, and so you get a lot of her in the captain's seat yelling out orders, yelling, "Tay!" for fire, and she has a really good voice for that.
Yes, no, this like she is among the best Gundam captains outside of Bright Noah in terms of just yelling "Kai!" which means evade and stuff like that, and yeah, just like shouting out the orders. I do like, so because I think it's kind of hard to talk about Ramius without talking about Natarla Badgerul. These are the names where like Murray and Badgerul or Natarla. I don't know how the fuck you're supposed to say it. Bajiuru Shoi, as you say in Japanese, because this is like a pretty unique setup. I feel like where the ship kind of effectively has two captains. You have Ramius, who is the actual captain. Who ultimately gives the orders, but she's like with Captain Bright, like she's not supposed to be the captain of a ship. Like that is not her role. That's not necessarily her training. She's just the highest ranked officer other than Mu, but Mu is like a fighter pilot and he's the only other fighter pilot they have. So it's like, he's not going to be in the captain's seat. And so she's sort of like in over her head, but she's got a good heart. And that's kind of like the dynamic between her and Natarla, is that she's got like this good heart, and even though she's willing to do, like, when push comes to shove, she will make the hard choice, but is still concerned about the fact that, she has drafted children, literal children, to fight in the war. Like, that is something that hangs over her, in a way that, like, Natarla is so, nope, like, this is just, we are in the army, and the army is about like soldiers following the orders that wise leaders give and leaders overlook and understand the whole scenario, and they give soldiers orders and the soldiers just do it, and that's how the army works, and that's what we're doing. And she's like very so practically minded, and so a lot of Ramius's material in the show is really like her butting heads with Natarla over this sort of almost like very like, this is one of like the Star Trek I think influences. It's a very like Kirk Spock-esque thing. Whereas Spock is like, no, this is the logical thing to do, Captain. And Kirk is like, that might be so, Spock, but there's also all these other things we need to consider. And that's kind of what goes on with their relationship.
I do think, because I agree, and I like the relationship. I really like Badgeruel. It's such a weird name to say in English, but I like that character a lot. I like her even more than Ramius, I think, and she gets the fucking best death. Oh my god.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, great character. I do think the like dynamic between them stays static for too long. I think they finally have they come to Jesus conversation when they're in Alaska and have this whole thing where Ramius kind of admits her weaknesses and says to Natarl that you'll be a great captain, and they kind of have this exchange. And I just feel like somewhere in the like 30 odd episodes leading up to that, I wish there was a little more like that friction between them came to something, and I think it's just an issue of a status quo staying too long. But I do like those characters and their relationship, and the payoff with it in the second half is phenomenal, like everything in this show.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the show just doesn't like focus on it particularly hard in that first half. It's just like a dynamic that's more in the background. but I do like it slowly building. I do really like, because I feel like the moment where it comes to like this sort of zenith, I forget exactly what's happening in like the episode in terms of the action, but it's something related to like them about to make a choice that's like it's probably the military sound, like the tactically sound choice to make, that it's also like not necessarily like morally sound or like morally like acceptable, and that's like always where Bajirul is in like those decisions. And there's just a moment where the captain Ramius just sort of stands up and she just shouts Bajira Shoi, and she's just so overcome, like she's been so pushed to this, like how can you possibly like countenance like all the awful shit we're constantly doing, all the awful shit that we are like forcing these children to do, that Nataro is like just sort of like full in on. And she's like, you know, when Flay comes up and Flay has like her like, I'm gonna join the military, and Nataro is like, yeah, great. And Ramius is like, I feel like maybe this isn't the smartest thing to do. You're like 15 years old or something. And I think this, like, yeah, it's maybe could have been something that could have shifted earlier, but I think it works in the background to sort of just like keep that pressure up, where Ramius, as one of your moral centers, always kind of reminds you that what is happening here is fucking wrong, and you shouldn't be accepting it, because Nataro's accepting it, and it feels weird how much she accepts all the stuff that's happening.
Right, exactly. And I think it's good to have a character like Nataro who is not a bad person. At no point is depicted as like she is evil or anything, but she is more of a company man. She is someone who she is a soldier. She believes in the military. I don't think she's like super ideological, but like she obeys the command structure. And I think that's a good perspective to have in the show to like flesh out the Earth forces like as a thing. And it's, I think, very valuable, particularly in the second half, as she has this crisis of conscience like all the characters do, you know?
Yeah. And this is where, Jonathan, if you have not looked this up, I want to blow your mind for a second. Yeah. Did you know that the voice actor for Nataro and the voice actor for Flay are the same voice actor?
No, they're not. What?
Yes.
No.
Both of those characters are played by Hoko Kawashima, who is a great voice actress. I have absolutely I mean, you cannot tell at all. They have scenes where they talk to each other, and you cannot fucking tell. Yeah.
What the heck? They don't ever do that on Gundam, right? Where like they just have one person play two like main every episode characters?
No, like you'll definitely have because you see I have it in Gundam SEED as well, where you'll have like one of your main actresses, like Kotone Mitsuishi also plays Izak's mom, who you see in like a handful of scenes. That's because she's just like a background-ish character. Like I can't think of anything where you have two actors play two major characters on the show. And it's like, and I feel like I knew this before and had forgotten it, and then I looked it up, and my mind was blown again. It's like, it seems impossible. It seems like it has to be like that credit is misattributed because like there was a flashback for Nataro or something where Kawashima voiced like a younger version of the characters. Like, no, she just straight up voices those two characters for the whole show. I don't know why it must be that she just was so good in like auditions or something that they're like, well, we'll just have you play both of them because you can't tell that that's the same actress.
Or they cast someone else for one of them and something fell through, and then like last minute they're like, this person's very talented. Yeah, it feels like that probably was never the plan, because that would be crazy. But yeah, no, I had no idea, Sean. I would never be able to tell you that.
Yeah, it's crazy. Kawashima Hoko fucking is a fucking pro. She's very good. She and you know, she also plays a totally completely different character in Gundam SEED Destiny as well. Like,
in addition, probably well, wait, no, she couldn't play these. They both die. Never mind.
You know, there are flashbacks you can have. I'm pretty sure that those characters like have voiced roles in some way in SEED Destiny, even though they're dead.
Wait. Gundam SEED has flashbacks, Sean?
Let's not talk about that yet.
Okay, we'll get to that.
Yeah, that's a
what other characters do you want to go into here?
Because I think the last major one, because you know you've got like Miri, the like Toto's girlfriend, and there's maybe some stuff to talk about with her.
The person who is literally just Frau Bo's character design to a T.
Yes, just yeah, it's 21st century Frau Bo. I feel like she doesn't have a lot that's interesting other than the moment where she just tries to fucking murder Dirka with a knife, which that's very good.
Yes.
That scene is very good.
She has her whole relationship with Dirka, because she tries to murder him with a knife, and then she starts becoming the one who brings him food, and she's the one who makes Dirka kind of realize, naturals are people too. I actually really like her role in the second half of the show. It's minor, but it's important.
Yes, no, she does. Yeah, it's definitely it is an important character. But I want to talk about my boy Mulaflaga,
Mulaflaga,
the flyboy of the Earth Federation, the Hawk of Imperion. Fucking the best name in this whole show, Mulaflaga. It's so good. I love him so much. Voiced by the great Takahito Koyasu, who has been in a bunch of these so far. Most notably, he's Zex in Gundam Wing. This is just like a very good. I like that you have because you also have Raul Cruz is voiced by it's Seki. It's not Tomokazu Seki, who's Domon / Izak.
Tomohiso Seki or something. It's
it's another one. It's another Seki boy who voices Raul Cruz. Toshihiko Seki. It's very easy to get those two names mixed up. But he was duo in Gundam Wing. So I like that we have two Gundam Wing alums that were on opposite sides. Now are on the opposed sides again, but are on the opposite, right? So it's like now we have our Zex is the good guy and Duo is the bad guy. Yeah, I really like Mulaflaga a lot. He's not necessarily like the deepest character in the world, although I do think in the second half he starts getting some really interesting stuff. His relationship with Ramius, I like that development. But I like his just like relationship with Kira, where because he's like, you know, Kira's mentor figure effectively in that sense of like in the military like senpai sense, right? That he's the other pilot, he's the only other person that like can kind of interact with Kira on that level of like talk about being out there and fighting. And he's kind of like with Ramius, he always seems very clearly conscious of the fact that what is going on is fucked up, but Mu just like pushes Kira to sort of lean into it harder because Mu doesn't know any other way. So it's just like, you just have to fight because if you don't, like everyone's going to die. So you just have to do it. And he like, even while he knows that it's bad, he can't help but constantly be putting the pressure on Kira. I really like that dynamic in the first half of the show.
I do too. I like this character a lot. I think it's a great vocal performance. It's a great character design. It's a fun idea for a character. There's some ways I think he's underused. I think, you know, they don't really get him into a mobile suit until the second half of the show, and that just means like his capacity in fights is very limited, and I think it's something that makes the first half of the show, a lot of its action very kind of samey and repetitive, is that it's always Kira relatively solo because Mu is in a like core fighter. There's not a ton he can contribute to, and I wish we just got a little more like focus on him as an action character. And then there's this interesting dynamic where he is connected to Raul Lecruce for obvious reasons once you've seen the whole show, because Lecruce is a clone of his dad, Raza Flaga or something. It's something dumb like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they have this connection, and I really will get to the episode where all the exposition happens. It's really good, and I love LaFlaga's role in all that. The problem, I think if I were to name one like dynamics issue here, is that Lecruce and LaFlaga are connected, but Lecruce is the final enemy for Kira, and so Kira never really forges any kind of rivalry or relationship with this guy until the final episode when they're battling. And I do think that's one kind of significant problem. I love LaFlaga's death. We can talk about it. It is one of the great because it's 3 big characters die in that scene, and it's phenomenal. But it does feel a little like he should have had something to do with a climax with Lecruce, because that is where that rivalry is. And I think it's kind of an odd dynamic. I still love all 3 of those characters I'm talking about. I just think the dynamic is a little messy. But no, LaFlaga, A+, good character. Yeah.
And I really like the very slow, gradual way and the natural way in which they develop the relationship between Ramius and Mu, where it's like it's clear that like they're growing closer, even when there's not like it's like often hard to like point at a specific scene where it feels like, oh, like these characters have like advanced in their relationship. It's just like over the course of the show, while the kids are off doing their crazy kid shit and Kira's sleeping with Flay, even though Flay is Sai's like fiance and like all that nonsense that's happening. Like they're just having this like slowly maturing like normal adult human person relationship that like is this like very like steady part of the show in the background that I like a lot.
Yeah. No, he's good. He's kind of like if Ryu in original Gundam stuck around until the end.
Yeah.
And was a woman, so he and Bright would get together. Although, I would be okay with Bright and Ryu getting together as men. That'd be fine, too. Yeah. But Ryu dies.
I mean, Bright sure does spend a lot of time in the military away from Mirai. I wonder if maybe there's something going on there. Maybe Bright was never being totally honest with himself and his desires.
That's a topic for another episode,
If
Sean.
you want to learn more about that, Google it and turn Safe Search off.
Any other characters you want to talk about at this juncture?
I think that's like the most of the Archangel crew that I want to just kind of hit up on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then let's talk about the Freedom Gundam and the series of events that lead to the episode titled The Descending Sword.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have Kira is off in space with Lacus, just sort of like doped the fuck out, just not... right, like it's clear. I feel like, especially like those first couple of episodes, it just feels like he's like on pain meds. Basically, he's just like, "What the fuck is happening? Like, what did I do? What is happening in the world?" And he's just sort of like slowly having to sort of like contemplate. And I like this just like moment where he just gets to be away from everything and actually just sit, and like everything else around him has stopped, and he just gets to sit and think about what is happening, which he has never had really an opportunity to do. And then you get that call that he overhears to Lacus and Lacus's father that Alaska is being attacked and all that stuff, and he jumps into action. And that whole sequence of him getting onto the Freedom Gundam and then launching it at the end of episode 34, and then episode 35, basically the first half of episode 35 is the Archangel in that desperate battle. Right, like I think that at that point, have they learned about like the nature of like what is actually occurring here and like the strategy that's being employed? Yes, because the Mu has come back onto the ship, so they learn what's happening, and they realize like this is a losing fight. We have to try to escape. The ship is going to be attacked. Is going to get blown up by Jin Mobile Suit that is aiming right at the cockpit, and that's when a bolt out of nowhere from the heavens shoots down, blows up the rifle of the enemy Mobile Suit, and Kira comes in the Freedom, which is like the most appropriately like metaphor name for a Gundam ever, because he has arrived now fully unshackled from everything that has constrained him before. And this is the thing that I described it earlier as like this moment of like ultimate catharsis, where you have seen repeatedly over and over and over and over again Kira making this dumb choice, this wrong choice to be fighting this war on this side rather than trying to sort of understand the war and influence it as like an entity that he has like an ideology that affects it. And now he has finally decided to not exist on, like, not take the two choices that have been offered to him, right? He's been repeatedly offered the choice of joining the coordinators, and Othran repeatedly has been like, why are you doing this? Come with us. You're a coordinator. You're one of us. Join our side. Of course, all the Earth people want him with them. And he is finally, even though he comes in and saves the Archangel, I really love that they keep this distance. This, like, he's not joining them. Like, he cares about them and wants to keep them alive because he doesn't want anybody to get killed in this stupid fucking war. But he's not returned to join the Archangel. He's returned to try to solve this problem that he has been wrapped up in, which is this this whole war and this like cycle of hatred between the Naturals and the Coordinators that he wants to end. And so that moment where he arrives, now totally free from the preconceptions that he has been given, free from the systems of power that have constrained and manipulated him to work against his own interests, and free to pursue what he feels is like a more ideal world on his own terms. And he arrives like fully empowered in the Freedom Gundam, all while the kick-ass song Meteor by TM Revolution plays. It is like just a like stand-up fucking, like, if this episode played in a movie theater, everyone would be like standing up, shouting and cheering, because it is just such a moment of like pure triumph.
It is, and I think it's these dual tracks you're talking about here, Sean. It has that element of like Goku coming in at the end of the Saiyan arc and stopping Nappa from killing everyone, where it's just this like, it's a lot of tension, and your hero is back, and that's awesome. And not just your hero is back, but he's more empowered than ever before. So there's this just raw superhero moment. But then there's also, it is the fulfillment of the long-standing thematic concern of the show up to now, which is what are Kira's motivations and what is he going to fight for? And this is the moment when he plants the flag and says what he's going to fight for. And so it is fulfilling so many different strands of what the show is doing, and that's why it feels like such a big stand-up and sheer moment, because 35 episodes have truly led to this in a dozen different ways, you know? And it's just a super slickly produced sequence, as you're saying, with the meteor, and the animation there is pretty good, and this entire battle has been so exciting. It's fantastic. I agree. It's one of those where I'm like, okay, I'm into this now. This is really good. I like Gundam Seed. And also the Freedom Gundam is a really good Gundam design.
Yeah, it looks so good. And it's one of those things where Kida has been stuck with this like very sort of standard basic Gundam design with the strike that is just modeled to look like the original. And now he arrives with his own Gundam that looks like it's unique. I like any Gundam that has some kind of wing-esque apparatus on the back, as is clear by my favorite Gundams being the Endless Waltz Gundam wing and the new Gundam. And so that's what the Freedom Gundam has as well. This is where, like, I kind of wish that we didn't use up the, like, to have literal angel wings on the back of the Gundam thing with Endless Waltz, because this is, like, the most appropriate moment to deploy that Gundam design. Because there's also all this, like religious, like, imagery that is tied into this of, I mean, you know, Kira literally dies and comes back from death, right? He is... So there is like a little bit of a meme in the Gundam Seed sort of fan community. We'll talk about more of where the meme really comes from with Seed Destiny. But there is this meme of calling him Jesus Yamato because he has this like very Jesus Christ-esque element to his character. And some of that is like people being a little bit derisive of it. But here in Gundam Seed, I think it is like a legitimately well-used dynamic of where he is reborn in the symbolic way through his death, and he is then brought back in space, right? So he's in space, he's not even on Earth, he's in the heavens with Lacus, who is a very angelic type character, and he returns to Earth like renewed with purpose to save the people of Earth, right? It is like a very clear kind of like religious imagery that is going on, and the Freedom, like the wings on the Freedom already have a sort of like vaguely angelic appearance. It would be even better if there were actual angel wings.
I think that might be laying it on thick, but I do like it, and I agree. And I think there's something about Kira's whole demeanor from this point on where he feels like something of a different character. Like, it's not just that he's renewed with purpose, he has a kind of confidence and a calm and an ability to communicate things that he does not have in the first half of the show. And I think he goes from being a character I was pretty lukewarm on to being, I think, one of the better Gundam boys. He's a really good I wouldn't put him in like the absolute top tier of Gundam boys, but he is a really strong one. And certainly, you know, I was sort of in the first half, he feels more on like, especially if you don't know what's coming, he feels a little more on the hero Yui end of things, of like a little generic. And by the end, no, not at all. He's a really strong character. And I think this turn really imbues him with something that is powerful and interesting.
Yeah, they even like they subtly redesign his character a little bit, even at this point, where his hair grows out a little bit more. He's a little bit taller. Like he looks more mature. It's like it's not like they don't like totally redo like his character aesthetic, but they like subtly kind of like age him up a little bit effectively to make him look a little bit more heroic and a little bit more confident. That all of that comes together. Yeah, this is also where you get with the Freedom Gundam, one of my favorite little dynamics of how they like demonstrate how it's really powerful, where it's basically Kira is playing fucking Panzer Dragoon, because there's this very video gamey, he's got that like map on his console, and then it like locks on and targets, it goes and he targets like 5 things at the same time and then shoots a bunch of lasers, and it's like the most video game ass thing ever. But it just like it is very satisfying. Like every time they replay that little bit of animation of him, or Othran then does it with the Justice as well, and they target and it plays all the targeting sound effect, and then he fires like all the giant lasers. I love that every single time. It's just a very like simple lizard brain. This is a satisfying sequence of flashing lights and sound effects that please me every time I see it.
100%. I also think with the Freedom and the Justice and some of the other subsequent mobile suits you get, the mobile suit designs of the show really come into their own, because I think it's not just that they're kind of aping mobile suit designs from original show in the beginning of the show. I also think the initial Gundam designs on this one are very boxy and kind of look like action figures to me. Like it kind of feels like Transformers, like I'm watching toys fly around. And I think in the second half, the Freedom, the Justice, and some of the other suits we get, like Le Cruse's final suit, feel much more like Gundams. Like there's more of a design aesthetic that is unique to this show. It's not quite so boxy and angular. They're really good, and I think the Justice, the one that Othran gets, is an all-timer. I fucking love that suit.
Yeah, it's fantastic. At the end of the Descending Sword episode, I do like. I mean, there's got so much shit happens in there, right? Because
yes.
you have Kira has that moment where the like Cyclops thing goes off, which are the bombs, and he grabs that one like random Zaft pilot to try to save them.
Yeah,
and I like that. I like this dynamic of where Kira has his big hero moment. He is now able to like fight for something that he actually believes in, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like everything's going to go perfect, right? Because he tries to save this person, and he does his best, but they ultimately die from the wounds that they had been inflicted with, which is, I think, a really great way to end the episode. You also get another just very violent sequence of images of the bomb, the Cyclops bomb thing that goes off underneath the Alaska base. Doesn't just like explode. It is a thing that they didn't revisit the same kind of imagery with the giant space laser later on, where people just sort of like pop like fucking like balloons basically, and it's very gross and just like graphic looking. And it is that thing where like Gundam SEED is not going to like kind of let you get off by just saying like, oh, there's a get off with like having a giant explosion in the background and say, oh, it's fine. Like, yes, 100,000 people died in the explosion, but you're not going to have to see them die. Here it's like, no, you're going to see these people just sort of explode in this like weird electrical field, and it's going to be bloody and nasty.
I don't know, Sean. I don't know why you get off to explosions. That just sounds weird. I don't get off to hundreds of thousands of people dying
in explosions. Not the way I was using the word get off. I was saying it's like you get off with, as in like you don't have to deal with the moral consequences. This was not one of my safe search Google jokes, please.
All right. Yes. So where should we go next? I mean, the story continues, obviously, and they make their way back to Orb, right? And that's kind of the next big phase.
Yeah, so then this is where, like, Othran comes down... Othran comes down in the Orb stuff. Yeah, so you're right. So they go to Orb, and this...
actually, there's one thing I don't want to skip, because Lacus has helped... Amuro has helped Kira get the Freedom Gundam, so she is branded a traitor. And episode 36, In the Name of Justice, which is where Othran gets the justice, he gets the mission from his father, but he also has that confrontation with Lacus in the theater that will be flashed back to many, many times. That's a really good episode, too, because we've had all the sound and fury of episode 35, but I think this one, focusing on Othran and starting him down, like his final path of the show, is really strong, and I think Lacus is seen here, and that whole setting of like them being in the theater, and you see that Lacus has her own militarized division, and she really did not need Othran to save her life at all, because she's got all these soldiers with her. Really good stuff.
Yes, yeah, that is a great scene. That's where you start to see like more of like the full scope of what Lacus actually is and what she's trying to do. She has her whole like weird underground army, basically. Yeah, very good stuff.
Yeah. And then there is the Orb incidents where they go there and basically Earth wants Orb's mass driver, because apparently there are not that many places on Earth where you can get into space. And Orb has one. Zaft has destroyed their other one in Panama. And so there's going to be this invasion of Orb. This is where we also meet Muruta Azrael. I love that the ultimate villain of this half of the show from the Earth side is just named Azrael. That's pretty good. And he's the leader of Blue Cosmos, and that's where the next side. And so this is where they're fully switched to fighting against Earth, because Zaft is not a big factor in this set of episodes. And this is also where Othran, during this fight, comes in and joins basically Kira's growing alliance.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things to zoom on here with this, zoom in on with this section. One is Azrael, who is kind of like our new big antagonist, because at this point the antagonist roles kind of moved to Azrael and then Othran's father on the Zaft side, with like LeCreuset sort of in the background and sort of like clearly up to some shit, but they don't really zoom in on him until the very end, and like all that stuff happens with the coordinators. Azrael is, of course, voiced by Nobuyuki Hiyama, who we just talked about last time because he is the main character in 08MS Team. But this is a much more, as we talked about with 08MS Team, that is like not a very normal, like standard role that Hiyama plays. He more plays characters like Azrael. So this is like very much in his normal wheelhouse of just like shitty fucking snidling evil motherfucker. He is like, Azrael is just, he's a very good, just fucking, you'd love to hate him type villain. That I think like Hiyama like really sort of, I think indulges that character a lot in a way that's a lot of fun.
Oh, he's great. It's a character that I think is a little broad for this show. I think the performance centers it. And then I think where they go with him in the second half, where when he kind of loses his shit in those final couple episodes, is very good.
Yeah, and I'm fine with him being a little bit broad. They do in the special editions, and then they edited it into the HD remaster. They had like a little bit more specific motivation for him in a flashback. So if you wanted more flashbacks, they had a whole other flashback in there to his like childhood. And from what I remember, it's like he's like jealous, and I think he got jealous of and got bullied by like a coordinator kid at school. I find it like it's a little bit like too
That's
on the
dumb.
nose.
Yeah,
it's just like it's unnecessary. I think like sometimes with a villain, it's fine to just leave them broad because it's like he's just a like petty racist motherfucker, and like that's fine. I think it's like enough for that character to just sort of be that. And when you try to like dig into it too much, it's just like sometimes like you know, a racist doesn't have to have motivation for them being racist. They're racist for like cultural reasons, not for like specific things tied to their past.
We have learned that the hard way these last 4 years.
Exactly.
And when I'm saying he's a little broad, I don't think that's a criticism because I think they execute it well.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like he's broad and they're not aware of it. Which is when the bad version of it happens.
Yeah.
But we get him. We get it is really satisfying in this section to see sort of this alliance kind of get formed with Ramius fully deciding to kind of come on to Kira's way of thinking, and the team coming along with her as kind of leaving the Earth Federation. And you get more. I think this is the section where all the orb stuff is strongest because you really get more of a sense of them as a nation and what they stand for. And I like a lot of that. And this is where they really start shining a spotlight on the theme of fighting and what does it mean to fight like a good fight. Because this show, if you compare it to like Gundam Wing, we talked about at length when we talked about that show, gets very stupid in how it talks about peace. And it's, Kanzai Heiwa of like or Kanzen Heiwa, the perfect pacifism thing. And it's just like, well, if we just stop fighting, maybe they won't attack us. And that's not what this show does. What this show does is we want peace, but if we want it, we're going to have to fucking fight for it, And so Orb kind of is a nation of that ideology of like, we're ready if we have to put up a fight, but we don't want to have to do that. And like Kira and Othran and the crew of the Archangel ultimately inherit that at the end of this sort of mini arc here, in that idea of it is okay to fight if it is for something you really believe in and that can change the world. This is not an empty fight, and I think it's a much more complex, nuanced, and realistic and meaningful to the 21st century world we live in vision of fighting than any of the stuff in like Gundam Wing with its dumb pacifism bullshit.
Yeah, it is definitely, it almost feels like a direct like attack in some ways against like Gundam Wing's dumb bullshit, because in like many ways Orb feels like it's vaguely similar to the whole Peacecraft. I forget what the actual nation's called, but Relina's like home nation and like where Zex is from and all of that, and there's fucking Kanzen Heiwa Shugi and all that bullshit. And here it's like it's a broadly similar concept, as you say. It is more about less about like just pacifism will save the world, and more people have to fight for what is right, and like violence is an acceptable means to a good end. Like, you can't just expect the world to be better by sitting back and like vaguely criticizing stuff. It is definitely one of those moments where like watching this show in the day before, like, or I guess 2 days before the election night, when you will be listening to this after that, it's something I've been thinking about a lot and it definitely was one of those, kind of like with Turn A Gundam, where when we watched that was right around the massive protests around the world, or around like America specifically, but there were protests even around the world about police violence in America, specifically directed towards black people. And that felt like a very appropriate moment to have like Turn A Gundam as a lens to reflect on those ideas. And a similar thing with Gundam Seed, of like thinking about this, what feels like the very like kind of toothless aspect of the left in America and the Democratic Party, and the thing that, obviously Joe Biden is the to say that Joe Biden is the preferred alternative between him and Donald Trump is not even a statement that needs to be said because it's so blatantly fucking obvious. But it's also something important to keep in mind that it's like just electing a Democratic president doesn't like fix the problems, because you are like staunching the wound and staunching the bleeding, but like fighting for actual change and not just sort of accepting the sort of two options presented in front of you, Zaft or the Earth Federation, Republicans or the Democrats. Like you shouldn't have to just accept the lesser of two evils for like your whole political structure. For elections, it's fine. It's like it is this whole feeling in like the political structure of America of we really need to push and like actively fight for and advocate for a better alternative than just what is given us. And it's very much what is happening here with Orb, and specifically the character of Lord Uzumi, Kagali's father, who's the one who sort of like embodies this like incredible strength that he's trying to pass on to these young people who he knows are the seed of the future, which he like literally calls them that. That like you are the people, you have to build a better world and actually fight for it, not like expect it to be handed to you. And that's like what all this Orb stuff is to me, and I think it's just phenomenally well done.
Absolutely. Episode 39 is called Othran. Kind of the same way there's the episode 28 called Kira.
Yeah.
And this is where Othran comes back to Earth, and he is in the Justice, and he makes kind of the split-second decision to help Kira in the fight against what I have learned are called in the fan community the druggies. What I was thinking of as the just cyber coordinators, because they're basically the cyber new types of this show, and they're on drugs and stuff. But yes, and they have this big pair fight, and it's very good. I think there's in this episode and the next one you get a bunch of Kira and Othran fighting together against the three druggy boys, and those are some of I think they just are the best choreographed fight scenes in the show. They're just really, really good action sequences. I clipped a couple and put them on my Twitter of moments because they're just really full of like really good action beats, and seeing Kira and Othran finally join forces as friends and allies it's like, it's the enemies becoming friends thing. It's great. It's just always a good trope. It's really well done here. I fucking love it.
Yeah, and it is very good payoff, more or less about 10 episodes after the Kita, where they have their like standoff across the fence, that little moment, they now are back together and they're actually friends. And then Othran shows up with a fucking Darth Maul lightsaber because it's 2002, or I guess it's 2003 at this point. But yes, it's very good. It is just the most early 21st century thing that like Darth Maul lightsaber. It's in. Let's do it. Let's put it on a fucking Gundam. Let's go. And it's very good.
I love the Justice. The Justice Gundam is a great design. It is red, which I love, but it also like has these transforming parts. It's got the big wings. Also, it has the double-bladed lightsaber, which is phenomenal. There should just be more double-bladed things in fiction and in mecha stuff. It's so good. It's such a cool mobile suit. It and the Freedom together in action is just consistently awesome. I love this fucking thing.
It is a fantastic mobile suit. And then that brings us into one of the best episodes of the show, episode 40, Into the Dawn Skies, where this is the episode where Lord Uzumi's like metal is fully tested, and he decides to have Kita and the rest of them use the mass driver to launch into space. And then after they will launch, he's going to fucking blow up Orb and blow up the mass driver. And it is if the re-entry into Earth episode disappointed you in the action and all that kind of stuff, the getting into space episode definitely fucking makes up for it, because this episode fucking rules.
I was just about to say that, Sean. It's like this episode more than makes up for re-entry into Earth being kind of boring this time around, because like I don't think this is the most interesting like logistical case of getting back into space. Like Unicorn Gundam has a really good one like that. Zeta Gundam has like 5 that are all phenomenal. But what this one nails is the emotionality of it and the sense of like kind of the climax of it. There's just so much that happens. You have this new crew kind of fully constituted with Othran there, with the Archangel, with the Freedom Gundam and Kira, and they're all coming together to make this like big getaway. Kagali having to say goodbye to her father. Her father, like you said, testing his metal and just going out like a boss, blowing up the mass driver. It is so good. It's also like our climax on Earth, because this is structured like OG Gundam, where you start in space, go to Earth, go to space, and it's 3 phases. So this is the end of the action on Earth. It is so great, and the final scene is all scored to the insert song that is used several times in this period, Wheels of Dawn. And that is a phenomenal song. As you say, the second best song in Gundam SEED behind Although We Were Always Together. And it is just, it's such a good scene. It's such a phenomenal final 5 minutes. I love it.
Yeah, it's an incredible song. And then the, like, final moments of the episode right before it goes into credits are so powerful, of where it's like, it's something where the show almost, like, it goes a little bit like, it sort of, like, breaks a little bit from obvious, like, reality, where the whole thing, it fucking explodes. They have launched up into space. The mass driver explodes. The, like, factory and all that stuff in Orb have exploded because everyone else has evacuated. And then it just cuts to Cogali's father standing in the fucking flames, the Lion of Orb, standing there, like, looking up, basically. Even though obviously he would be, like, in fucking pieces because he was standing literally at, like, where the explosion started. But I love that imagery of him standing in the flames, like, passing on and looking on to the future that he has entrusted to his adoptive daughter and then her brother, as she has found out, because he also gives her the picture in that last moment of them as twins. Yeah. It is just like that image of him standing in the fire is so powerful.
It's so good. You also get one of my favorite moments in the series where Kira and Othran are out fighting the druggies, and they are trying to get back on the Archangel as it's going up the mass driver, and Kira is the first one, and he lands on the ship, and Othran is trying to get there, and so Kira, in the freedom, extends the hand, and there's this great succession of shots where Othran gets there, their Gundam hands, like, meet, he pulls him on like a brother, and then you have the two Gundam heads kind of, like, nod to each other, and then they turn around and open fire on the druggies. You know, Gundam does not do a lot of personification of the mobile suits. It's a fairly rare thing. Like, G Gundam, I would say, probably does it the most.
Yeah.
But normal Gundam, like, they are machines first and foremost. And that's true in SEED as well. But for this moment, and I think it's because they very rarely do this on Gundam that it works, is they just let you, like, read on a lot of emotion onto the mobile suits. And it is like, this is their bodies reaching out, and it's like this, you know, like 90s action movie moment of him pulling Othran up, you know, and then the two mobile suit helmets looking at each other. That shot is so fucking good, because they don't, like, reanimate the faces to, like, look more human or anything, but it's just, you so clearly read on the emotions of Kira and Othran onto the mobile suit helmets. It's a phenomenal moment, and with Wheels of Dawn playing under that, oh my god, it's so good.
Yes, it's very good. I think it is also I like that they had to decide how, when the Gundams hold hands, how do they hold hands, and they, like, intertangle their fingers to just, like, fully nail the bromance between Kira and Othran, to just, like, really hit the Fujoshi, or the, like, the Dojin creators that are going to, you know, again, your safe search joke. They're going to have a lot of fun with that relationship, and they're going to
sex this the fuck up.
Yeah, they know what they're doing. These are some smart people. Know how to sell themselves some fucking Gundam.
This scene was so good, I actually went and watched the second act of the episode again in the HD version to get a feel for it. And I actually think they do improve on this in the HD version, because what they do is they leave Wheels of Dawn playing through the end credits instead of starting, because this is where we get our third end song, starts in episode 40. And in the original, there's kind of a hard break where the Wheels song ends and then the new ending song starts. And in the HD version, they just let it go, and you sit with that into the credits, and it works really well. It's very slick.
I would say I respect that choice in the HD remaster. I do think I slightly prefer the original, because the way the original does it is it has the Wheels of Dawn play basically up to that moment where Kira and Othran get onto the shuttle, and then when the explosion happens, it hard cuts at the explosion, and there's no music for the whole explosion. And then when it cuts into Cogali's father standing in the fire, it plays the sad Gundam SEED music, which is, like, one of their main leitmotifs. And then from that, it then goes into the ending theme. But both really good ways to put it together.
I like that we have the alternatives there, because they're both very good. Yeah. All right. And then we have space. We have our encounters in space, you might call it. Mm-hmm. And our final batch of episodes, where I feel like we should take a moment here to talk about maybe Raul Lacruce, who becomes kind of our main villain at this point.
Yeah, because I think we can, try to like maybe sort of combine this last section all together, because this is where like the plot momentum like very like kicks up into overdrive. Because you have Raul Le Creuset, who is our Char. He is very much a Char clone in this episode. I mean, he's not literally a clone of Char. He is a clone, not a Char clone, but he is a Char clone, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah, so Raul Le Creuset, he is. I do have to just like give credit to Toshihiko Seki that I think he does of all of the non-Shuichi Ikeda like Char-esque performances. He is the one I think that does the best. Like,
I agree.
There's just something about he's not just copying Shuichi Ikeda. Like, he's not trying to do an impression of him or something, but he captures a certain essence of the like intonation and some of the delivery to get a similar effect while still like playing a fairly different character. Because Raul Creuset, while there are obvious like heavy inspirations from Char, he's still very much a very different character in most respects. He's not like a secret half good guy who is like trying to stop the war and all that stuff. He's not like a like long lost Hamlet-esque prince. All those elements of the Char character are not there. Although I think they kind of maybe want you to think that some of that stuff might be there in the background until you realize that no, he is like the most like nihilistic character. He is just purely fighting because he has nothing of his own. He is a clone who has been created by this whole system, and he has nothing to live for. He has, as I think Mood describes, he has no past and he has no future. And so he just lives to spite the world and wants to watch it burn because it is something that has created him and given him nothing. In a very like vaguely Frankenstein-esque kind of thing. And it is, I think it's like a really great performance. I think like some of the ideas around the character I think get compressed too much in the very end, because there's a lot of stuff with him and his background that you don't get until in what is that episode? Is like 47 or so. It's like really
it's 45. It's the opening door.
Yeah, so it's like episode 45. So you have basically 5 episodes that you know what his actual backstory is, which is not, I think, quite enough to fully unpack everything there. As you say, Jonathan, like some of it gets weird and kind of confused with his rivalry with Mu that kind of gets taken away, and Kita has to kind of fill in as a replacement. So some of that stuff gets a little bit messy, but the core of the story and him as a villain, as he just like descends into like raw insanity in the section of the show, I think is like very effective. And a lot of it is driven by what I think is just like a really fantastic performance.
I agree, because Toshihiko Seki, we loved him as Duo in Gundam Wing. He's so fucking good in that show. And Duo being probably the most interesting of the Gundam Wing pilots.
Yeah.
And then you get here, and I agree 100%, like, it's an immediate step up from Zex. And I think, I don't want to criticize the Zex voice actor, who is also Mu Laflaga here, because I think he's given kind of a harder, because his is more close to Char. He has less to distinguish himself.
Just Char in Gundam Wing.
Right.
Like I had because I was thinking about some Gundam Wing stuff when watching Gundam SEED, and I had like already forgotten that they just redid all of the Char stuff down to fucking Char's counterattack in that series until I was rethinking about it. Like, man, they really fucked up that shit.
Yeah. So like he doesn't have as much to play, but I think it is a weakness of Zex is that the voice, it is clearly trying to do Shuichi Ikeda. I think Toshihiko Seki manages to evoke Shuichi Ikeda without really doing an impression, and it's a really good voice. And I think this show kind of gets to have its cake and eat it too, in that it gets to do the aesthetics of Char, which is, you know, cool, mysterious villain dressed to the nines with a mysterious mask and a cool, like, tone of voice. But that's as far as it goes. That's everything else with this character is not Char-esque. And I think if we're comparing the 2 direct Char clones we've had so far in Zex and in this guy in Le Creuset, I would say the gap between Le Creuset and Zex is as big as the gap between Char and Le Creuset. Which is to say that Char is still like, you know, Le Creuset isn't on that level, but he is so much better than like a Zex or something like that, you know?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's a thing where it's I think they're smart in not trying to have Rao be a cornerstone of the show in the way that Char is with Mobile Suit Gundam, right? They kind of split, in some ways they kind of split Char into 2 characters. They kind of split him into Rao and they split him into Othran, and sort of get the more noble elements of Char, put him into Othran, and get the more despicable villainous elements of Char and put him into Rao. And I think that like works really well in the show's favor to not try to combine all of that into one role and try to just replicate Char the way that Gundam Wing does, because you can't replicate Char. Nothing will be able to replicate Char. He is a, miracle character that nothing will ever be able to do like that again. So if you want to have a Char-esque element to your show, you have to figure out a way to do it differently. And I think Gundam Seed does it exceptionally well.
Yeah, because like I said, there's kind of there's the direct Char clones like Zex and Le Creuset, and then there's the ones that like Tomino will do this, where like someone wears sunglasses, like Harry Ord in Turn A Gundam, or in Victory Gundam you have I forget his name,
Chronicle Asher.
Yeah, Asher, who he has a mask, but it's for a completely different purpose. And otherwise, those characters are nothing like Char, but you just get to have the fun of like a character design that vaguely evokes it. Zex and Le Creuset are much more, these are the Chars of our show. But I think Seed is, as you say, much more creative with it, in part because Char is an anti-hero in a lot of ways. He's an antagonist occasionally, but he is a noble figure. Le Creuset is the Joker. He's an agent of chaos. He is out here too, and he might be the most successful Gundam villain, because he really does push humanity to the brink of extinction, and all but for some quick thinking at the very end by some of these kids, he would have destroyed all life on Earth. He really does almost get there.
Yeah, he's a real motherfucker, and I do really like that turn. It happens around after the turning point. It happens around when you get some like the Panama invasion and stuff like that, where you start to see a little bit more. They tip their hand a little bit of like, okay, this guy is up to like some shit that is like on a very different level than just he's a like effective pilot for Zaft. Like he is very much on his own agenda, and I like the slow buildup as you start to realize just like. It's especially when he's like after the in-jammer canceller technology, which is a very funny name for technology because it is very much like I have nuclear power. Well, I have the nuclear power jammer. Well, I have the nuclear power jammer. It's like, well, okay, fine. But he's after that technology, and then realizing that he wants to just give it to Earth because his goal, he is a good foil for Kita, even if they didn't necessarily do all the work. In a thematic sense, he's a very effective foil for Kita, because both Kita and Rao are like third parties trying to affect the war. But Kita is a third party trying to affect the war to get it to end. Rao is a third party trying to affect the war to get it to escalate even further. And so he is trying to escalate the violence. He's effectively an accelerationist in some ways. He's just like, let's lean into it harder and harder and harder until everything is burned down. Everything is destroyed. And then maybe, I think Rao doesn't even care what happens after that, but maybe humanity would do something better. Who knows? Maybe they could fix the cycle of hatred. Probably not. But I just want like this world that has created me and spited me to burn to the ground. And so that like way that he and Kita are similar positions but on opposite sides of the scale, they do a pretty good job of that.
Oh, 100% agree. Yeah, he's great. He's pretty terrifying there near the end, and the final fight and everything with him is very good. So good foil, and I think we are in agreement on this character. What else to talk about from this final big batch of episodes? I think the obvious place to start is Lacus fully revealing herself as the fucking god of this show. I am so on board with the idea of a pop idol princess raising an army and a counter-media propaganda organization to stop her fascist government and try to end a war through negotiation. She is great. I love this entire side of the final stretch of the show.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I love her like second costume. That's this like fucking like pop princess shogun basically.
Yes.
It's just a really great outfit she has. And yeah, there's just a lot of fantastic stuff here where they have that really good montage of after Patrick Zala like gets on to like what is happening here with Lacus, and he has Zaft agents try to sort of dismantle the operations she's had, and they have this montage of Zaft agents killing a bunch of Lacus's people, including ultimately killing her father, and that whole sequence is, I think, just like really good at like Lacus is like serious about this, right? And I like the way the show respects her and her power and her authority, that she's not playing second fiddle to someone else. Like, she is the figurehead and leader of and mastermind behind this whole anti-war organization that she is putting together. And yeah, she's just like the coolest fucking character. I don't know. It's like, she is, I think, straight up my favorite character in Gundam Seed. She doesn't, and it's an interesting thing upon rewatching it, that in my memory, she had way more screen time, and she has quite a bit of screen time, but there are massive stretches of the show where she's completely absent, but her, like, presence in the show is so immense that when she's there, I feel like your focus is on her entirely, because she just has so much charisma as a character and as a performance and just as a concept that it's just, I'm, like, just completely in love with her. It's so fucking cool.
Absolutely. I'm in general agreement with that. The final 5 episodes play like a good stretch of final 5 episodes of Gundam, and I know because I watched them all in one go last night. And it basically starts with Flay being picked up by the Dominion, and she has the neutron jammer canceller. And of course, this starts the series of events where Azrael gives it to the Earth government and encourages them to bust out the nukes. They bust out the nukes, and then Zaft busts out their big honkin' space laser, because it's Gundam, we gotta have a big honkin' space laser. Yep. They call it the Genesis because this show is inspired by Star Trek. And and we have our final sort of set of fights. And I think I really like all of these final 5 episodes. I think the penultimate one has some animation issues we can talk about, but it ends on such a high note. And then I think the finale is one of the best Gundam finales, and that's saying something.
Yeah, I think this is like, the whole last stretch is just so phenomenal, because you have everything with, like, the moment where, I think is a little bit in an earlier episode, but the moment where Natarla comes back and she is now the enemy captain, and it's like everything of what they've been doing with that character just like slots immediately into place, and it's just such a, like, I remember the first time I watched it and that reveal happening and me being like, oh, of course, like, oh my god, what a fucking great, like, trick this show has played, to like really make you like this character and sympathize with her a lot. And especially because the last time you see her, I feel like, is her most sympathetic, where she is like her most human. She's having this real heart-to-heart with Remius. It's clear that she really cares about what's happening with the Archangel as she's like getting kind of shuffled off and shuffled away. And then for her to come back and be, you know, like evil Ramius, basically, just what a fucking great turn. And it adds such a like deeper element of drama to everything that happens in this whole section, that you have Natarla, like, obviously not fully on board with what's occurring, but she's very true to her character in that she's just going with it. Like, she's not happy that she has to sink the Archangel. She's not happy that she's fighting against Kira, but she's going to do it because that's who she is. I think that's such a powerful construction of a character that you can see all of that at play, that she's so true to herself even when there are these like conflicts you can see in her.
I agree completely, and my favorite thing to top it all off is that the Dominion is just a black white base, or a black Archangel. So it is literally just like it's almost like the suits by the Titans in Gundam Zeta Gundam, where they just take the Gundam Mark IIs and paint them black. It's like, this is the evil ship, and that's so great, and it looks so good on screen next to the Archangel. It's a really nice touch.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's just one of my favorite things that Gundam Seed does, that like no other Gundam show does that. No other Gundam show has like, let's build up a second like sub-captain to then have them become a like antagonist in the last stretch of the show. It's just such a fucking smart thing to do.
It's very smart, and you know, I think they keep her true to her character too, because she becomes an antagonist but not a villain, you know? Mm-hmm. And it's a really good relationship, and she stays pretty true to herself through to the end, including like the way she breaks with Earth feels very true to how she would do it, not how Ramius would do it, you know?
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, can we talk about the end of the penultimate episode and her incredible death?
Yeah, let's just jump into it.
Yeah, because it's so good you know, at this point, like, what everyone is trying to do is destroy the Genesis because they know it's about to attack Earth. In fact, 2 episodes in a row, 47 and 48, both end with an identical shot of the Genesis firing, which I think is a little, but it works. But they know the Genesis is going to have this third firing. The Archangel is trying to get through the Dominion to go and attack the Genesis, and they're in this battle. There's this really interesting moment where you think Natarl, however you say it, is going to back down, and you think Ramius might back down because they don't want to fire at each other, and instead they steel themselves and fucking fire this massive barrage, and the Archangel just barely comes out on top. The Dominion could keep fighting, but she's like, fuck this, I'm not doing it. And so she tells everyone, abandon ship, go to the Archangel. She locks the door and just stays in there with Azrael and just lets them both die. Azrael keeps shooting her. It's extremely violent and brutal, and Ramius has to give the order to just fire on the ship and blow it up, while Azrael does this final firing from the Dominion that fires this blast at the Archangel that Mu LaFlaga has to come in and take the brunt of and dissolve into space dust to save the day. And I tweeted after that, I'm like, oh, this show is properly brutal. It took some lessons from Tomino. This is the real shit, you know?
Yeah.
Oh my god, it's so good.
Yeah, it's a real fucking, like, gut punch of a final episode where... there's something about, like, the stacking of the character deaths of we're both going to kill off one of the major antagonists for the second half of the show. We're also going to kill off Natarla, who has an antagonist-esque role here, but is also a character you've been with, like, literally for, like, the whole show. Like, she's, you know, you see her in episode 1. You've, like, built up this attachment to her, and so she's going to die. And then also everybody's favorite flyboy, Mu LaFlaga, finally, and his fucking last line... It's so good because he has his catchphrase throughout the whole show that he's the man who makes the impossible possible. And he flies up and he intercepts the beam with the strike. And he goes on the radio with Ramius and tells her that, like, remember, I'm the man who makes the impossible possible. And then he explodes. And it's just like, fucking hell, Mu. You are the best fucking dude in space. I love you so much, Mu LaFlaga. It's an incredible sequence of events.
And this is why Gundam works, is because every Gundam show is a self-contained 50-episode unit, you can kill whoever you want. There's no need to keep people alive because you have a long-running series. And I love my various long-running anime, you know, but I also love when you can have this short one where you can just let there be massive consequences, and if you get to the end and you're going to kill half the cast, fuck it, you can do it. Not every Gundam show does it, and not every Gundam show should do it. But this one, it works very well. You know, there would wind up being a sequel to this, but it does not feel like they were hedging their bets at all.
They didn't know they were going to make Seed Destiny. Seed Destiny only happened because Seed was so popular. So it was not written with a sequel in mind.
Well, exactly, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It feels like they left it all on the table, and that's exactly how it should be, including the big death in the finale of Flay, which is maybe the cruelest death we've seen since Uso's mother in Victory. Mm-hmm. The way they do it, where Le Creuset decides, just out of mocking this poor kid, he's going to fire on this ship that Flay is in, and Kira gets over there, he puts the shield down, he's like, yes! Because he blocked the beam, and then with one of his other bits, Le Creuset fires through and just blows her up. That is one of the cruelest things I've ever seen in Gundam, especially because Flay is the representative to Kira of all his failings and people he cannot save, because his original sin in his mind is not being able to save Flay's dad. Good God, that's mean.
Yeah, it is like just an act of like abject cruelty. And it's where it's been a long time since we had like a ghost lady in Gundam. It does feel like, as I had actually forgotten that it had, like, obviously I remember that Flay gets fucking killed in the end. I had not remembered that they just do the full like Zeta Gundam-esque, or like very like early Tomino Gundam new type-y. There's this vision that Kira has, and there's something I really like about Gundam Seed having a lot of stuff that is very directly reminiscent of new types. Like, you have the weird new type flashes that Rao and Mu have directly with each other because they are like weirdly fated together because he's the clone thing. And then you have the seed factor, which is like very new type E, but it's nowhere near as like sort of defined as what a new type is this like very direct thing that exists as like this theory. You're just not like exposed to it that much. And then having this vision of Flay where you're left not knowing, is this like real? Is this like a real in as much as like a weird psychic vision can be real, but is it real in the way that like a new typey stuff in the UC Gundam can be real? Or is this something that Kira is envisioning for himself? Like, or is this something that is less scientific and more spiritual? Because Gundam Seed definitely feels like it has this kind of like spiritual quality to some of it that a lot of Gundam doesn't necessarily go into as much. But it does have this moment of that feels very appropriate for Gundam Seed. That it has this very kind of bittersweet quality to the conclusion, where is a thing where while Gundam Seed sometimes feels like it's a little bit more of an adolescent Gundam because it is aimed for that audience, and so it has like the heightened teen drama that's a little bit unrealistic and that kind of stuff. It has this really mature outlook of you have to choose to fight for something that is right. Like the show is not going to let you off by just saying that like you're going to fight for like the lesser two evils, you're going to fight for like the side that's most convenient for you, or you're just going to exist on the sidelines and not fight for anything. I think the show is going to dismiss anybody who comes to that conclusion and say like you are wrong to do that. It says you have to find something that is right and you have to fight for it. But just because you are fighting for the right thing doesn't mean you're going to succeed, or certainly doesn't mean you're going to succeed in all respects, right? And so it's like, I like that Kida, for as powerful as Kida is, because he feels to me like the most powerful fucking Gundam protagonist. Like because some of the shit that he does is just so ridiculous. And him just like shooting down 1,000 nuclear missiles that are all launched at the plant, and like some of the stuff that he does. It's like he feels so powerful. Even when he's not powerful, though, he still can fail, and fail in a way that is like reflective of and like a mirror of how he fails all the way back in episode 13 when he can't stop the shuttle from getting shot by Izak. And it's like a very similar framing as what happens with Flay. But the difference is that this time he is still fighting for something right, even if he couldn't save this one person in front of him in like save their life. Because he is trying to be compassionate and he's trying to fight for the same thing, he did save Flay in a way, right? He did save her in this like spiritual, more humanistic way. And I like that sort of bittersweet quality to it, where he does succeed in some ways of making Flay a happier, better person than who she was, because who she was bitter and angry and cruel in the early stretches of the show, and her relationship with Kira made her better. And you get that moment there where she was, even if she didn't know entirely what was happening with that nuclear chip and the plans and all that, like she came around to be someone who was also trying to fight for what was right in the way that Kira is. And that's, I feel like, what is communicated in that last moment they have in this like new typey ghost way. That hits me really hard. Like, again, it is something that definitely, I think it maybe hit me harder than it normally would, because I watched it on October 30th, I think is when I finished Gundam Seed. And so it was like, stress about the election and fighting for like political good in the world is a thing I've been thinking about a lot. And so seeing this moment and thinking about like what it means to fight for the right thing, to fail, but still have that not divert you from your cause or cause you to forget the smaller successes you've had along the way. I just found that whole sequence really powerful for me.
I agree. I think this final episode, if there's any Gundam finale it reminds me of, I do think it's the Zeta Gundam finale, because it's not as dark as that, but it is similarly balls to the wall in that it is like 100% action, and it is also denouement via action.
Yeah.
Which Tomino Gundam always puts those in close proximity, very close proximity, but like original Gundam, the denouement does technically come after he's like saved the day, you know? It's Amuro getting back to the ship. In Victory Gundam, you have that last scene with Katagina in the little village on Earth at the end, right?
Yeah.
But in Zeta, it's all in one piece, you know? Camille getting his brain fried and ending the war by killing Paptimus. That's the end of the show. And there's the like 90-second musical thing of Fu bringing him back, but that's it. And this show has a very similar feeling to me of it is all action through to the end, and the denouement sort of happens within that of it's everyone kind of looking out, and you see that Othran and Kagali survived because Kagali, in this beautiful moment, tells Othran, stop running from things. It's sometimes the hardest fight is to live. And so they live together. And then it is Kira floating out in space in what I feel is a fairly clear homage to the end of F91, which I love.
Absolutely.
Because this is how you know the Gundam Seed people knew what they were doing. They know F91 is good. God damn it. And it's a very clear F91 homage, and he is floating out there. The bird flies by, and you have this final moment where he's looking out in space, and he's crying, and he's saying, what did we fight for? You know, what was this? And he says, it's our world. And perfect image, perfect line, drop the mic. This is worthy of Tomino Gundam.
Yeah.
That's how good this ending is.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. Like, it is. It's a thing where it's like, it's so much better than I even remembered. Like, I remembered really liking the Gundam Seed finale, but it hit me so hard this time, and it is, I think, a combination of when I'm watching it, I think it's a combination of like seeing better a lot of like the things it's doing earlier on, and so being able to like pick up some of its setup, and really be along for the ride. But there is this just really powerful conclusion there of, you said, that bittersweetness, but this moment of hope of that the seeds have survived, right? And so to talk about like the seed thing, of the concept that these are the young people from whom like the future is going to be built, right? And I do really like that they get, at least Kagali has hers, because you have 4 seed people, right? You have Kira, Athran, Kagali, and Lacus. Kagali and Lacus both have theirs activate like in the last couple of episodes, and I like that they got at least one natural in there to do it, to like be like, this is not a thing that like coordinators build the future. And it is, you have your like breeding pairs effectively, nicely selectioned off for you, Kira and Lacus, Athran and Kagali. It is nice. Like, I like the whole like mirroring of them, of Kira, who was on the Earth side, and Lacus, who's on the space side, coming together. Then Athran and Kagali also similarly on opposite sides, coming together across their differences to build a future together. Again, like, there's like clear, obvious like religious imagery that is like in like metaphor that is built into Gundam Seed on purpose, and so there's a very like Adam Eve-esque Garden of Eden or kind of thing that is happening there of we can build a new world from the seed of these 4 people who have, these young people who have from these experiences learned so much, and you've seen how much they've grown. Maybe Lacus is the one who didn't grow as much because she didn't need to, because she's fucking super cool. And so like everyone else got up to the point where Lacus is. And then they have to now, it's up to them to figure out how to move forward and build a better reality rather than be constrained by the systems of power that existed beforehand, and to build something new that can make a better future. And I just like having a Gundam that has a happy, hopeful ending that is also doesn't just feel like it earns its hopeful quality in the ending, by not just being simple about it, but by showing like how hard and painful that kind of hope can be and how you can earn it.
Yeah, I really sat with this ending for about half an hour last night when I finished it. And my thinking is also influenced by when we're watching this, Sean. I finished it Halloween night, 3 days before the election.
Spooky.
Yeah, exactly. And the spookiest thing on earth is the election of fascists in American government. But no, there's something about the ending of this show that to me really ties the themes together. And I think this show, the way I put it, is it's a war cry against apathy. It is the entire ending and the entire show is constructed as that first half, like we said, is Kira playing by a script without really knowing why he's playing it. And that script is basically just the structure of normal Gundam stories. And so it's using it in a very savvy way if you know the tropes. But then that midpoint, he and Athran both realize, good God, I hate these roles I've been thrust into. I do not want to shape the world in the way I am being told to shape the world. And so they wake up. And it stops being a rehash of other Gundam stories because they very consciously move past it. They want to stop this war. They want to do something seemingly impossible. And I think that final episode really gets this quality, like I said, this war cry against apathy. There's that moment when he is fighting Le Creuset, and he is just, Le Creuset is like mocking him and saying over and over again that I'm going to kill everything. He's expressing his nihilism. And in this final blow, Kira doesn't say anything. He just lets out this fucking like war cry, this gutter. It's a great performance moment. And he has his beam saber and he comes in and kills Le Creuset with it. And that feeling that he has in that moment is so resonant of having woken up from apathy and fighting for something real and meaningful, and you know what it means. And I think that has an obvious resonance to our moment in time in 2020. I also think it's interesting for when this show was made, because I think a dominant political narrative of the 2000s around the world is apathetic thinking. It was a huge scourge for the United States under George W. Bush, where just political apathy became like the law of the land, and just, letting this guy skate off with it and not worrying about things, and art became very apolitical and apathetic. And it really wasn't until the election of Barack Obama that there was this kind of rise in political awareness again. But in Japan, there's a similar thing going on. This is also the same climate that gives rise to Kinji Fukasaku's Battle Royale in 2000, where Japan is undergoing this surge of youth violence in the 90s and the early 2000s. And it's a big political discussion of what do we do about all these kids committing crimes. There were these high-profile stabbings and robberies, and there was just a lot of sense of disaffected youth not knowing if they were going to have a future, acting out. And Battle Royale handles that in a very extremist, maximalist metaphor way in what it does with that film. And I think it's a brilliant film for that reason. And there's a reason why it resonated so controversially with, the ruling class in Japan. But I think this show has something to say about that, too, of, these kids who are out there to fight, told you have to go into battle, and don't really know what to do about it or why. And by the end, they have a purpose. And although the world is in ashes at the end, there is this hope and these tears of joy of we can build something out of this. The seeds are there, that I think you have to tie to that contemporary moment as well. But it has these resonances on to today also.
Yeah, it's a incredible ending to, I think, what is an incredible show. I just love Gundam SEED to death. I had such a great time watching it, and yeah, it's just it was. I think I had said in a response to a tweet that you had, Jonathan, that I found this second viewing rewarding in ways that were surprising to me, just because it's I think I had kind of, in the 5 years since watching it, and I think some of it is later Gundam stuff maybe affecting my memory of Gundam SEED. I think I'd underestimated how good it was, because I think it really does something it's really good, and I think it does something really kind of unique and valuable within Gundam, that to push it forward and kind of do something else. And it's taking a lot of cues from Tomino, but at the same time it feels like the specific message and where Gundam SEED goes is something that does not feel like it's rehashing a main theme or something from Tomino's Gundam. It feels like it totally owns its own theme and its own ideology.
Yeah, I think of the non-Tomino shows we've watched, of G Gundam and Gundam Wing and After War, and I love two of those three shows very much for very different reasons. I think this one feels the most like it forges its own identity absent. It's hard to compare with G Gundam because it's such a different thing, but this just feels like in the realm of actual Gundam-ass Gundam, this is the one that feels like it's broken out of something and feels like there's a future beyond Tomino out there for the series. Yeah. It feels like this is the show that bought it another 20 years, which it has.
Absolutely. So I think there's some stuff to wrap up that we kind of suggested that we would talk about, and we didn't quite hit along the way. I want to make sure that we talk about the flashback part of it, because that definitely is something that we actually have to address rather than making a vague jokes about it. So the Gundam SEED is interesting in that it has a lot of flashbacks in a lot of different ways. And I think it's kind of complex talking about it, because I think sometimes I see people who don't like Gundam SEED and they just say, oh, it just uses flashbacks all the time. It's just terrible. And it's maybe back it up a little bit, because there are lots of the flashback stuff is definitely excessive, and it's clear that oftentimes it is to save production time. But there's a lot of the flashback usage is also very clearly deliberate, and I think whether they would have had an infinite amount of budget or not, they still would have used the flashbacks, because Fukuda's style as a director is very much, he likes to, and it's very different from Tomino. He likes to get more into the specific moment psychology of the character, and he communicates that through flashbacks by flashing back to a handful of really key moments and lines of dialogue that character has encountered in their past that is informing a decision they're about to make. And when they reach that point, he'll do quick flashes of flashbacks. And so you get lots of that moment with Andrew Waltfeld and Kira, where he has the gun pointed at Kira. Kira flashes back to that moment probably 15 fucking times over the course of that show, but always at a moment where he is about to make a decision, that moment where he has this idea of, oh, I'm someone's enemy, is important to him. Same with when Nicole and Toru get killed. They use those flashbacks a lot as like, I mean, for just trauma, like straight up trauma for the Othran and Kira, thinking back to that moment that they saw their best friend get fucking exploded. So I think it's a thing where some of that flashback usage I think is actually really effective, combined with the really good score. But it is then also mixed in with flashback stuff that is excessive and clearly as a way to kind of cover the production that Gundam Seed feels somewhat cheap at times, or maybe possibly mismanaged. I haven't found like a good like authoritative source that has said if there were like production issues that led to the flashbacks, or like what the thinking was and how that happened specifically.
Sean, I want to say, like, it's not just Gundam Seed.
No, yes.
All the anime of the early 2000s feel like they were budgeted for 19 minutes and had to fill 20 to 22. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, this is a very Naruto. Naruto has this a lot, like specifically for shows I've watched where like Naruto leans really hard into the flashback thing, and doesn't usually have much of the good use of the flashback, and it's mostly the like, oh well, we've got 5 minutes of the episode left, but we don't have 5 minutes of plot left, so let's roll up the Sasuke flashback. Let's go.
Well, and that's any long-running manga adaptation does that. One Piece, Naruto, Dragon Ball, pick your poison. They will all do that because they have to adapt a weekly manga series, and there's no way to do that.
I want to be very clear, Jonathan. Some of that is what happened with Naruto. Some of that was not because the manga. Some of that was they had more than enough manga to adapt, and they had budget shit. Like, so it is a combination of both of those.
Yeah, but even like the non-long-running shows of this period, there's a lot of the let's do 60 seconds of flashback interspersed throughout this episode. I think it's honestly, you can kind of almost trace it on like the show as a bell curve, because it's the middle of the show that gets worse about this, like the 20s and the early 30s. I mean, you have 2 recap episodes back to back, basically. Mm-hmm. So like, clearly there was a problem there. I think the last 15 episodes or so are almost entirely the kind of flashbacks you're describing, the good kind, that is like has a clear diegetic purpose. But it is early in the show, and then that middle section gets really excessive, where it feels like they just were trying to figure out how to budget the final half, and then it's mostly okay from that point on. But yeah.
But it is definitely in that middle section. It is the episode after the recap episode, where even if you watch the HD remaster, they didn't do anything like special to that like half like soft recap episode. It is still in there in the HD remaster. It is definitely, that is like the most egregious. Man, we have just hit a halt. We need to, it's just the realities of that kind of budgeting and production stuff. And if that's like the price you have to pay for how good the last 15 episodes are, I'll gladly pay that price, because the budget does, I think, get like noticeably better a few episodes after they have like the most dire flashback bullshit. So it feels like...
I agree with that, yeah. I do think there's some cheap stuff. This show doesn't just reuse animation, it reuses footage for battles. Like, all Gundam shows reuse animation, but usually it'll be the cell animation with a new background or something, or it'll be recut. This one, like, all the stuff with the druggies, there are some animations with them that just that footage gets used like 7 times in 3 episodes, and it becomes actively confusing to the geography of combat. And I assume that's stuff that's fixed in the HD remaster, but I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't watch like a consistent amount enough of it to answer that definitively, but it's probably most of the action stuff gets quite a bit better. Although if you watch the HD remaster, like the nature of the flashbacks are that like it's not like you're not getting the flashbacks. They can't just like cut like the excessive flashbacks out because the episodes would be like 5 minutes shorter. So thinking about HD remaster stuff, we can't talk about this. I know that we will have Gundam fans who are listening to this that we have to talk about the most controversial thing in the HD remaster, which I specifically texted you the other day, Jonathan, to watch, which is the reanimation and the slight recontextualization of Nicole's death. That I think is, again, it's a very controversial change that the HD remaster made that is interesting. That we will probably revisit some of that when we talk about Seed Destiny, because I think some of why that change happens is in some ways informed by stuff that happens in Seed Destiny, because obviously the HD remaster happened like 5 years after Destiny happened. But it is, so basically the difference is in the original version, Nicole comes up, he has his injured Gundam that he stumbles towards Kira, tries to swipe at Kira with like a big rod or something that he's got. Kira ducks the swipe, swings his sword, cuts Nicole in half. Nicole fucking screams Athra, and his head fills up with blood, and he fucking explodes, and it's like, oh my god, that is the grossest fucking shit I've seen. And then the HD remaster, how it is framed is Nicole runs up with his injured Gundam, has the rod, swings at Kira, and while he swings at Kira like kind of sidesteps, although not even really, and Nicole just sort of stumbles into Kira's outstretched sword, and it just kind of looks like Nicole sort of cuts himself on half because he's kind of a moron and just sort of blows up. And the whole death is the same. He still goes, Aslan, and his head fills up with blood and he explodes. But instead of Kira actively swinging to cut Nicole in half, it's more Nicole sort of, it's like, it looks like it's an accident, and Nicole sort of like stumbles into the sword.
Because what's important in the original version is that Athran and Kira are both full of rage, and they are fighting to the death for the first time, and Kira basically offsets that rage onto Nicole and actively murders him, and it's the same thing that Athran will do in the subsequent episode to Toru when he throws the shield.
Yeah.
It is offsetting the rage to another person, and in this one it makes it look like a complete, like, sad war accident, and yeah, I don't like that change, Sean.
It's a very weird change. It's like there's not a lot of stuff like that in the AC remaster. Like that's the only one that's very notable. I'm sure there's like a bunch of like little tiny changes of some of the context, but yeah, it is a weird change that like we'll probably like talk about that a little bit more with Seed Destiny and some of the stuff that Seed Destiny does and maybe what motivated it. But it just feels awkward, and it's like I don't know why. It's very weird. It is the thing that it always makes me think of is it is like I think an even worse version of the Han shot first thing from the special editions of Star Wars, which I'm fine with Seed taking the like weird twin thing from Star Wars. I think it's like, but you don't have to take the Han shot first thing too, because it's very much the like we've gone back, we've taken a moment that makes one of our characters that's supposed to be likable look maybe a little bit more like unlikable because they murder somebody. In more or less cold blood. I guess Kira is not cold blood, but he still fucking murders the shit out of this little piano boy. And so we don't want that to just make them look that violent. So we've added a little slightly different thing to sort of mollify it a little bit and make them seem less at fault. And it's just like, just let your good guys seem bad sometimes would be my thing to say to that.
Yes. Okay, I think we've got to wrap this up, but quick, Sean. Reactions to the other theme songs, because there's so many. Invoke, the first opening.
2 thumbs up, great opening. It's the one I think of when I think about Gundam Seed. I like TM Revolution. Here's a fun bit of Gundam Seed trivia. TM Revolution voices Miguel, the first person that Kira kills, who's Athran's friend who gets blown up in the first episode.
Nice. I love Invoke, too. I think it's the best of the theme songs. Some of these other ones are good, too. But yeah, Invoke is a really good one. Yeah. Moment, opening 2.
It's pretty good. It's not as good as Invoke. I like it. But if you'd ask me to like hum a part of it, I wouldn't be able to.
I agree 100%. Believe, opening 3.
I think it's good.
I really like this one. This one's got a hell of a like rhythm. It's really upbeat. It's good.
I would have to listen to it again because it doesn't make enough of an impression for me to remember it directly, I guess.
Okay. That's my feelings on opening 4, Realize, which I think is terrible.
Yeah, I have the same thing. I think like it's a thing where Gundam Seeds, I think it's a part of a plague of me having watched like a lot of modern anime is a lot of the songs just sound like kind of generic anime opening themes to me. Invoke is the one that I think has the most like unique style to it that feels very specifically like Gundam Seed. And a lot of the other ones are like good, but not like super memorable. It's certainly not compared to all like the ending themes, which I think are really good.
No. Yeah, the ending themes are great, and Invoke is the one that sounds like a Gundam song,
yes.
You know? But the other ones just, they could be on any anime, and it would make no difference. All right. Anything else to say about Gundam Seed before we talk about next time?
I just want to really quickly, because we did a lot of our voice actor rundown, but I realized we didn't talk about the 2 most important voice actors of the show, because we kind of skipped over them. Just a huge shout out to Soichiro Hoshi, who voices Kira, who does a phenomenal job. He's been in a bunch of stuff. It's probably other biggest role. He's the main character in the Higurashi series, which is like kind of a horror-ish series that's very good. I think they are doing like a new one of those right now, actually. It's still airing. And he's also probably, for us on this podcast, would be best known as the voice of Goto Akechi in Persona 5. But just great voice actor who's been in a bunch of stuff. Very, very good. And then you have Zala, who is voiced by one of my favorite voice actors, Akira Ishida.
He's so good.
Best known probably for this podcast as the main character in Persona 3, and all these similar, like, he voices a bunch of characters that are related to the main character in Persona 3. He is also Gaara in Naruto, who's one of my favorite characters in Naruto. And then he's also Katsura in Gintama, who's one of my favorite characters in Gintama, as well as like a million other things. Like, he's a huge voice actor.
We've talked about him here before because he's Kaworu in Neon Genesis Evangelion. That
is right. Yes, he is. He's Kaworu in Eva as well. So he's in a bunch of stuff. Like, he's like definitely was in a lot of stuff even before Gundam Seed. I think Soichiro Hoshi had not been in quite as much. He was not as like big a voice actor before Kira.
Yeah. And we told you his Naruto role, so I've got to tell you his One Piece role. He is Cavendish. If you've seen One Piece, you know what that means. All right. Anything else to say here, Sean?
So for Gundam Seed itself, did you watch the after phase episode 51 Between the Stars?
Yeah, I think it's bad.
Yeah.
Why was that a thing?
I don't know. Like, I've tried to find out where it came from or what it was. I don't really know. It's like a 5-minute epilogue thing that it feels like it is they got the green light for Gundam Seed Destiny, and they're like, we're going to do a little thing that is like, because it is animated and uses the character designs from Seed Destiny. So I think it was like they were in pre-production on that, and we're like, let's do a little thing, because it came out basically alongside the first Gundam Seed recap movie, the special edition, as they call it.
Yeah. No, it's not terrible. It's just there's nothing it adds to the experience.
Yeah, it's just it's a nothing burger of a little thing, but I wanted to mention it because I'm sure we would have gotten like a comment of, did you watch this like 5-minute thing that says nothing about anything? It's like, yes, we did. It says nothing about anything. I think that's it for me on Gundam Seed, Mobile Suit Gundam Seed.
Well, Sean, do you want to go ahead and push ahead and make Seed Destiny our next episode?
Yes, Jonathan. It is time. It has been a thing many, many years ago when I was first watching these Gundam shows. There were 3 Gundam shows, Jonathan, that I wanted to eventually do a podcast on. I thought would never happen. The first was Mobile Suit Gundam. The second was Turn A Gundam. And the third was Gundam Seed Destiny, as I desperately needed to talk about this fucking show. And it is utterly mind-boggling to me, Jonathan, that somehow this is actually going to fucking happen, and somehow I'm going to get you to watch Gundam Seed Destiny, and we're going to do a fucking podcast on it. Never in a million years, if you had asked me, circa like 2016 when I had first watched it, that in 4 years, basically, we would end up doing a podcast on Gundam Seed Destiny, I would have never believed that. How the fuck are we here? It is amazing to me.
Well, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I am looking forward to it. And I will just say, I think that will probably be our last episode for 2020, will be the Seed Destiny one. There is a lot of stuff coming up for us in our personal, professional, and hobbyist lives. The PS5 is coming out, and we will be covering that on our main show, the Weekly Stuff Podcast, so November is going to be a little busy there. I will be traveling back home sometime around Thanksgiving. I am also doing a lot of schoolwork. I am studying for, just so you guys know, I'm a PhD student in Iowa, and I've explained this on the main podcast, but I don't know if Gundam listeners know, but I am in a phase of my PhD that I have to do these comprehensive exams, so I am having to do a lot of reading and watching, so I think I will probably have to move through Seed Destiny a little slower. My plan is to get started right away so I can do maybe 1 a day, 2 a day, and like get there faster. But I would expect that we will do it before the end of the year, but it'll probably be the last episode of 2020, and then we'll come back in 2021 continuing on and doing other things. But I think that will be our big finale for the year, which has been a really great year of Weekly Suit Gundam, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I will just say that we should also it's not a lot extra, but we should rope in the Stargazer 3-episode OVA into Seed Destiny, just because it's a thing where it's like, I don't think we'll have a lot to say about it, but it's long enough that I feel like we should at least say something about it. So it's definitely not long enough that we would do its own episode, because it's not that substantial. But we'll wrap in the Stargazer thing, which is different characters, but is set in the Cosmic Era that came out in 2006, so a little bit after Seed Destiny finished. So yeah, we will finish out this year of Mobile Suit or Weekly Suit Gundam with the Cosmic Era and Gundam Seed, and I am very excited in a lot of different ways, Jonathan, for us to finally be watching fucking Mobile Suit Gundam Seed Destiny next time on Weekly Suit Gundam.
Bye.